Most of it, yeah, it's some sort of a game, isn't it? It's like just, modern humanity's just got so many games going, so many distractions. It's
Well, part of what Kenneth's talking about here is the way that noesis, which is what we've sort of built the whole modern order on, is a game playing mentality. It wants there to be rules and systems, and it wants to reduce everything to a great mechanism so that we can compute and calculate the answer in advance. It's like the goal of modernism is to make a perfect machine so that none of us ever has to make a decision for a choice. All we have to do is follow the rules and a perfect world will ensue. And you can see this all over the place in the way that we systematize things. So part of what he's getting at in this quote, which I'm glad you pulled out, because it's pivotal, right, to this introduction, is this way in which when Kant seeks to set aside all irrational bases for ethic, for morality, and for how to decide what it is that we're going to do, he succeeds so thoroughly that we're not actually left with any basis for determining these things other than the rules of the game. The rules, what are the propositions that have been laid before us, and what are the rules of logic we're allowed to follow. And the problem with that, as we've seen perfected in the 20th century and continuing into the 21st, is that you can make propositions and a perfect set of rules for anything, not just for good things, but for evil things as well. And then you end up with a great tug of war for who controls the rules and propositions of society, because we've got no basis for agreeing or disagreeing on any other basis. That reduction of profound things to the level that they just become moving pieces on a board following rules is a great project of dehumanization that Kenneth Smith and Nietzsche and others are very skeptical about.
Okay, yeah, I've sort of become aware of that trend, to that desire to create the perfect machine, beloved by all my beloved rationalists.
Yes.
And they're there, can't you see? It's the utopia where, we'd be all sitting around like meaningless pieces of meat being prodded by a machine what to do next.
Go ahead.
I saw a video just the other day.
Yeah.
That China has decided to pull out of the global monetary game. I was surprised by that. I mean, it's like, apparently they started doing so in 2017. And that doesn't mean they're not going to play some other game internally.
Right.
It's just that, so that's interesting. That is going to result in an economic war for sure. It may evolve into a hot war. Who knows?
Right.
That's why Taiwan is in such a funny position, because that's part of the game in a way, But it's interesting though that they realize, that program started out with that there are three eras in modern China. Well, in the modern communist China, the Mao period, the Deng Xiaoping period, let's engage, we're so poor, let's engage. And now the third period of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping, what? And he says, now that we acquire enough power, we're withdrawing from the game that Deng put us in. So that is a very, very interesting thing that's going to change the world. So I just want to say that to warn you of the global situation that's liable to happen.
Well, and that is completely relevant.
Hang on a second. That whole theory of trying to get rid of the US dollar, we don't like working for the US dollar anymore. That's been everybody since the year dot in China for a long time. They've all wanted to bypass the American dollar except for the Fed, who wants to keep it going.
Right. Right.
Well,
Yeah,
the Europeans are in the game in a way. So it's not just the Fed is in control, but the euro dollar is it's actually pretty much strong too. So
presently, the US dollar has done what it's been doing for a long time. It dominates the market.
Yeah.
Whether that can change, I don't know, but they've been trying to pick at it, war with it since. They're always at war. The major world monetary powers and banks have been at war since the year dot. And when you see a thing, we're going to jump out of the American dollar system, well, they've been wanting to do that since the year dot.
Yes. Yes. But, you know, what this underscores is that without either God or nature or any other source for resolving disagreements, all we're left with is the system justifies itself, which means if somebody else uses a different system, then that justifies itself. And now the two systems are completely irreconcilable because there's no such thing as a meta system. You know, there's no such thing as a source of principles that we could use to diagnose both systems and figure out if they're in alignment with something. We've jettisoned the idea that our systems have to be rationalized in terms of anything in particular, and so they become self-justifying. This is kind of the momentum of the modern order, is this idea that the system justifies itself just by being a system. That it's good to be systematic, that it's good to be rational, that it's good to be organized, it's good to have a law-abiding society, and we're not supposed to ask questions about whether they're good laws or bad laws. Everybody has to follow them, because if they don't, we have no way to reconcile the differences. We jettisoned all that. We're too modern for all that, right?
Okay, you're claiming we don't question whether the laws we have now are good ones or bad ones. The moderns don't do that.
Well, we question them, but not on the basis of any shared authority, because we've jettisoned shared authority. The law is its own authority now. We've created a kind of a closed circle. And what it means is
who shared its authority before? God.
Well, there were two different sources, right? During the medieval epoch, there was God, and during the ancient epoch, there was nature. But we decided we wanted to be free from both of those things. This is what the freedom of the modern epoch, which we don't think too much about, although we talk about it endlessly. The freedom of the modern epoch is the freedom from any basis for making these decisions other than the laws that we already have, the systems that we already have, other than
Judas and nature and God. Yeah, got that. That sounds pretty good.
Yeah, God and nature, right? We dethroned both of them. So.
And we've replaced them with what?
Well, nothing. Our system's based. This is the thing: is when you on the surface, what we've replaced them with is human needs and human desires and solving human problems.
Okay, that's Max Stirner. He said you're trying to raise the generalized concept of mankind over me as a new God.
Right. This is modernism, right? But when you scratch the surface,
off you go for your back. Pick up your bags. I see what you're doing. Nick off, out the door.
Yeah. Well, and that's the problem, is when you scratch the surface of it, you realize there's so much variability in human beings. We can organize ourselves around almost anything. That what we've done, as with pragmatism, what we've done is claim to have simplified the problem to focus it on the parts that matter, when what we actually did is remove any basis for being able to decide what matters. And so if everything comes down to a vote, or if everything comes down to who has the most money to enforce their will, then ultimately what we're left with is might makes right, just with a lot of, justification on top of it.
Well,
go ahead, Phil.
Free will is a fundamental part of modernism.
Yes.
But free will presumably is controlled by reason, and reason creates the structures the system, you could say, to engage in something. And it seems to me one of the structures that free will produce with the structure is to create the structure of property, right? That what you own. So you could see how the landed gentry, in a way, underscore that, because property means that you have an engagement with the system through free will, and those that don't, they don't have property. They're not part, in a way, they're not part of the system in a sense. They're excluded. You can see how the voting goes. And I sort of raised an objection. I hate to say it in the Hegel discussion, because I like Hegel. And I'm not sure if Hegel accepted that, but nonetheless, it was proposed in the discussion. And I say, well, the problem with that is that excludes other things. For instance, take nature as an example. Nature, you could think of it as like just matter stuff, and then there's also living nature. And it seems to me living nature, maybe it doesn't have reason. Okay, I'll actually maybe accept that to a certain degree, but they certainly have will. The will to survive, right? How do we count for them as just mere stuff?
Right.
Right? Like, once you make that judgment, then you could certainly say, well, you know, Blacks, Native people, well, they have some will, but it's much less so. And you could begin to have that gradation. And it just seems to me, once you ignore nature, at least the living nature, I would actually count the material nature too, as just mere stuff that you own because you're sitting on the property rights. Then in a sense, you are jettisoning any sort of moral understanding to that system. And it's just become blatantly obvious. And maybe it's what wasn't obvious back in the 18th or even the 19th century, but it's become blatantly obvious that we have gone too far, right? And that animals and possibly plants and other things have a degree of rights because they have a will on their own. Now, that doesn't mean that they have all the rights. They can do what the hell they want. Just like everything else, you have certain limits in the freedom, and that's how the contract of society controls free will. The free will is not totally free; it's within a structure, but it just seems so excluding of so many things that I don't want to totally exclude. And it just seems to me that means that human beings, and human beings with property is actually what it means. It's the only one that truly have free will. Everybody else, you could go screw yourself, right? It's like, that's just the way it is. And that just seems wrong to me.
Yeah.
You know, in a moral sense, because you're saying that anything that don't have logic and reason to think, and then property, then you could just forget it.
There's this thing we talked about in the last couple of weeks about how the rise of any epoch begins in the previous epoch, and it defines itself in terms of that epoch. It makes the most sense as a response to the overwhelming power of that previous epoch, and that a crisis occurs when it succeeds in overthrowing the previous epoch, which is without that to justify you, without those things you're pushing against. Well, now what's your explanation for your value system and for the way that you organize the world and envision the world? And in the two cases where we can see that arising, the medieval and the modern epoch, we see the same thing happen, which is that the argument makes a lot of sense in the proposition of the epoch makes a lot of sense at that moment. When you, for example, modernism rejecting all the tradition of the corrupt church at the period of the church's maximum corruption, the medieval church, when at that point in history, they're buying and selling forgiveness, and it's just like there's nepotism left and right. Everything is just openly corrupt. At that moment, it makes sense to say, we need to push back against these traditions because these traditions are rotten. And it would be better if we started over and we just got together and talked about what our problems were and solved them together, instead of always bowing down before kings, who claim to have the divine right of heaven while they're engaging in very non-divine behavior. And the same for, God's representatives on earth, who at that point were a mess. The problem becomes, once you've pushed all that away, or at least it's not that it's gone, right? It survives into the modern era, but once you've dethroned it, now what's your justification for continuing to rule, right? Not just as we're the ones who are going to free you from this problem, but now that we're freed from the problem, now what's your justification? And the justification suddenly becomes a problem. It's lost. It's like a stool where you've pulled out one of the legs, and now the thing won't stand up anymore because it was dependent upon.
I kind of have a partial answer, and this may seem like it's not in the right track, but I could see at the moment of transition, the picture is very clear. There are many things in the picture, but they're out of focus. Okay, let's accept that. Okay, so therefore the revolution, it justifies that. But after the revolution, you have to then become, there is a thing where it's supposedly reason is self-critical, right? I remember a Black artist who's a conceptual artist. I actually saw his work, so and he came and spoke. And he talked about how he was given permission in the Virginia, I think it was Historical Museum, to do anything he wants, as long as he doesn't damage anything, right?
Right.
And so he just rummaged around and he saw these portraits of these sort of families of, the I guess the landowners. And many of them have illegitimate children, and they were Black. And they were kind of decent enough to include them in them, but they're way in the background, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was kind of like, well, you see the people in front, and there was these people in the background. They're like minuscule and out of focus, whatever. He had this show of these family portraits, and what he did was he shined the spotlight on the Black kids in the background. It completely changed your perspective. Like, whoa, I never realized that kid was back there and he's part of the family. It's like, so if you're self-critical enough, you could begin to see things emerging that was there all along.
Yes.
But why don't we at least have the ability to see things emerging when it was hidden during the revolution?
Yes.
That seems horrendous to me.
Well, that's the thing is noesis can be used if noesis is leashed to reality. If noesis and gnosis are tied together, then noesis can be a powerful tool for self-introspection. But if noesis is not leashed to reality, if it's leashed to itself, then it can be used to rationalize the very thing that it ought to be doing introspection and criticism of. And that's the problem we get. That's the difference that Kenneth Smith and others talk about from this tradition, about the difference between noesis when it is in its full infinitized form, where it does not allow itself to be coiled up and infantilized, versus its finitized form, when it becomes its own frame of reference and coils back in on itself. It becomes an enclosure. Instead of pointing out to the world and the things that we can do and how we can think about the world, it ends up coiling up and pointing back to itself, and it becomes a trap. And of course, that's what the Bonausos character type is about, is that they have allowed their noesis to become their master, so that it points back to itself and becomes enclosing instead of opening. And the same is true of gnosis. You know, we're all born with that capacity as infants to be, you know, fascinated by experiencing the world, drawn out of ourselves, the curiosity, the need to know, the need to relate to the larger whole. But that too can be finitized and coiled back in on itself so that it becomes self-justifying. So that instead of saying, well, I know I feel angry about this, but maybe I should look more deeply at what's going on in the world and maybe transcend my anger to have a deeper connection to what's happening. But if I lose that connection to the world, then the anger becomes self-justifying, and now I become, you know, parochial and driven, a creature driven entirely by my internal weather. And that's the formation of the doulos. My appetites and feelings dominate when they should be half of the picture in relationship to the world around us that helps to draw us out. So that finitizing and closing thing that happens, it's the hazard of reason on the one hand in noesis, and it's the hazard of emotion and sensation and need on the other, that they have this liability to self-enclosed if it's not constantly being trained to teach us to use it in the way you're talking about. That's what should be happening, right?
Just one more brief comment. I know I'm being too long. That's what we talked about in terms of revisionism, right?
Yeah.
Self-justification. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Donald, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, I think, just for Phil, that somewhere Hegel has a really neat little one-line argument in favor of private property. He says things belong to the first person that claims them, because it makes no sense to say that they belong to the second person that claims them. So,
oh my God.
You know, so maybe Hegel was a modern also. You know, no, but I'll have to say, about my own modernism, y'all gone beyond where this was relevant to what you were discussing originally, but
Woohoo.
I have a hard time myself as a modern seeing that someone can exercise rights. So what comes first, the rights or some sort of economic independence? Having the means to defend your rights, protect them, and exercise them, versus having the rights and using that to obtain these means. This, to me, is in modernity, is something that I think about, because I guess I think about it a lot when you mention, you know, these inalienable rights with respect to our Constitution. I do think that both what you say is true, and it makes a lot of difference where we think rights reside.
Right.
You know, are they a gift by governments to men, or are governments the creation, a created thing by men? That makes a big difference.
Yes.
And it's, you know, and I think about that, and I think about, if you're, how does one even act independently? How as a modern, even if you're in one of those parts of the world that has inalienable rights, of course, in the United States, under our legal system, I've alienated my rights countless times. Every time for employment, I've had to sign a non-disclosure agreement,
Right.
or accept that I'm in I think the term, a position of trust under the United States government. I alienate that which is inalienable.
Right.
And I keep thinking, I'm waiting for a court sometime to say, if it's inalienable, well, then you can't do that.
Yeah.
Something that's inalienable can't be alienated by an act of will.
Right.
Or even a agreement. So enough. But I like Hegel's one-line argument. You know, of course, he didn't ever talk about that zero could own it.
Well, see, right? He's a modern, right? He thinks somebody has to own it.
Somebody has to own it. That's right.
If we're not colonizing everything, then what? How can the world even work unless there's domination and ownership?
You know, I only want what's mine and what's next to mine.
Right. Yeah. You know, what the thing that you're talking about before I call on Stephen, which I'll do in a sec, is that because there is no basis for deciding these questions other than their own definition, the circularity of the system of logic and reason that's associated with the way these things are constructed, we get caught in these contradictions. Are they alienable or inalienable? If they're inalienable, then an NDA is not valid and never can be valid, right? And in fact, there is a major battle going on in legal circles right now over that very question, over whether NDAs should be banned because, you know, they trample what is in our Constitution as an inalienable right. And yet, a lot of companies can't see how they could do business at all if they can't swear their contractors to silence. And so it creates this struggle between pragmatism within the existing system on the one hand, and what's supposed to be the foundation of our entire legal system on the other. And it's telling that even though the inalienability of some of those rights is supposed to be the foundation, at least half of the legal scholars are happy to say, oh, well, screw the foundation. I mean, you know,
contract, they place contract law
right
over inalienability of rights.
Right.
And one other question, since you talked about the Gnostic so much, are the Banisoi allowed to enslave the emo peoples? That I just wondered where your argument.
There'd be no modern epoch. That's the whole basis of modernism, is that the rational intellectuals make a system that harnesses all the emotional and experiential people. That's what we are as an epoch in a systematized way.
Yeah,
but, you know,
I've mentioned before that I think that, like, the archetype of the modern world is payday loans.
Yes.
You're so right.
It has all of the key characteristics of modern life.
Yes. Yes. Well, I mean, before I call on Stephen, going back to the very first quote he put in the chat, you know, that Kenneth Smith line talks about infinitely reverberating artificialities. And that's the issue, is that, you know, in the natural world, archai are what drive everything. Deep principles of order that are like fountains of organization and unfolding. And their interactions with each other, the intersections between them, countless intersections between them, are what give the world its shape and help to steer the course of changes. And in trying to make our own system of laws and rules, we're attempting at the level of, and here we get a distinction that Heraclitus and some others make between capital L logos versus lowercase nomos, where logos is the logic of these archai in nature. And it's not anything else. It's not the Christian logos. It's not the modern logos. To the ancients, it was the resulting pattern and logic that comes from the way these things unfold. And he said, and Aristotle and others talk about the way that in order for human civilization to work at all, we have to construct our own little set of laws, little lowercase, because they're not naturally authoritative. There's an artificiality to the laws and rules we put together. But in the ancient world order, they thought that the way that you succeed is that you make a nomos, a set of human laws that corresponds to and maps onto the logos. And it is that mapping onto that gives it its harmony, so that it's allowed to be a sustainable civilization. Or so the Greeks thought, although they couldn't pull it off for more than a few centuries at a time, ironically. But they put their finger on this very problem. The artificiality of the rules and laws that we follow is an enormous Achilles heel in our attempts to form civilizations. and that the more we deviate from the logos in the structure of our nomos, the more it's going to run into collisions. And whenever, as Kafka says, you know, in the contest between yourself and the world, back the world, the logos will always triumph in the long run. So the problem is, in the modern epoch, we're attempting to construct a more organized, more rationalized, more systematized, more scientized nomos than anyone ever has before, which seems theoretically like a good thing, except we're trying to do it entirely on the basis of human decision making. What is the will of the people? And that means we have removed the logos from the picture. So now we are creating an entirely artificial schema of organization. And as a result, whenever the different parts of this schema collide with each other because they're not coherent with one another, our problem is we no longer have any basis for deciding which is which. And this is what sets up these artificial reverberations, right? Are NDAs legit or are they not legit? Does your right to free speech trump the right of a business to be able to have the secrets required for it to succeed or not? Which one is dominant? And the answer is, it can't be answered in the absence of some other frame of reference, because they're both artificial positions. We claim that the one is an inalienable right. We claim that the businesses have to be able to keep secrets to do business. And because these claims are artificial, it's just from one generation to the next, the swaying of fashion that determines which one wins over the other. And this is why it reverberates. And this is why the reverberation is artificial. And all that labor and work is going into resolving something that never even had to happen in the first place, because none of these are real conflicts. They're real for us only because we swim in these artificial waters. And so the currents in them make a huge difference in our lives. But when push comes to shove, none of that's real, because the whole system is based on turning away from what's real. Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah. Well, in the question of noesis, how would that figure in, say, the Canterville ghost? What was it, Oscar Wilde's story?
Oh, remind me. I haven't read this one.
That's where the American family comes to England and moves into an old castle, which has an old English ghost in it. So you have this clash of the modern against this very tradition-bound ghost who's driven to abstraction by the Americans. Unfortunately, if you don't recall the story, we'll pass over.
Oh no! Now I have to read it.
It's you haven't come across this story.
No, Oscar Wilde.
Yeah, the ghost comes up, tries to scare the American. He's got his clanking chains. And the American says, I always use Acme oil, squirts it on the ghost's chains. And the ghost is just standing there. What is going on? These Americans. So you've got this sort of intense noetic culture, which Oscar Wilde is making a joke about in his novel. Oh, look, I'll just find it. Go on, find yourself something else.
I put a link. Well, I'm glad you brought it up, because Kenneth Smith loves Oscar Wilde's work. He quotes him all the time, because Oscar Wilde had not just because he was witty, although that's worthwhile in its own, but because he was witty in his criticism of modernity. He had an unerring instinct for where is modernism hypocritical, and then he wouldn't just go at it the way Nietzsche would. He would turn it into some brilliant, hilarious story in which you couldn't help but laugh at modernity as a result. So I'm going to put this on my to-read list for this week. Thank you, Stephen.
I mean, the most notable Oscar Wilde work is The Importance of Being Earnest, play.
That one, yes.
Right?
That one, but also The Portrait of Dorian Gray.
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
and that's become a massive parable for modernity, in which we get to look all pretty, but at the price of what? Somewhere hidden away is great anti-cities of entropy created by all our garbage and pollution that we don't want to look at or talk about. And as long as we can keep making that uglier and uglier, we can keep looking pretty. That's Oscar Wilde just did a great job on that one too. He also, in his final works that he was writing from prison, He wrote some amazing things, just really profound. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I have thought that Nuremberg had answered part of the question, right? Because these guys were just obeying orders of the system, right?
Right.
And then we argue, rightly, there are certain orders you should not obey,
Yes.
right? I thought we answered that, at least in a limited way, that human beings have rights. And when you go into that space, you should realize you should disobey the order because there's a higher order of some sort. Now, I didn't extend to natures and the trees and so forth, but at least in a limited way. And we do kind of have that. We try to have that, in the United Nations to a certain degree, right? That there are human rights, of sorts, But I think the problem is that at least part of our civilization is trying to forget that part, that we have at least answered that question to a degree, okay? Right, and only to a degree, only to the point that we can reinforce it. When you go to, China, you can't reinforce it because of something else. But nonetheless, I thought we had answered at least that part of the question, but it keeps popping up that is actually not true in the world. So that's a problem. So even when we try to answer it, it doesn't get answered. So
well, the infinitely reverberating artificialities. We keep thinking we've covered the ground, and then somehow we keep not having covered it. And in the Nuremberg trials, that is one of my very favorite points of history to study, to understand modernity. Because on the one hand, we respond to these terrible catastrophes by trying to hold people accountable for what they did that led to them, and drawing forth universal principles that we want to then apply to make sure that modernity doesn't stray in that direction again, right? So far, so good. But when you actually study what happened, the Allies had to dance a particularly careful dance, because some of the war crimes that we were accusing the Axis of doing, we had also done.
Yeah.
Like terror bombing civilians who have no actual role within the military, just bombing neighborhoods, bombing, where clean water facilities, things like that. That was a war crime. We weren't supposed to be doing it, but we did it a lot. We didn't just do it a little. We did it over and over and over. We did it a lot. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the animated works of Studio Ghibli and Hayao Miyazaki, who makes these incredible animated features. But Studio Ghibli had a couple other directors working with them, one of whom was Isao Takahata, and he made a gorgeous but incredibly painful film called Grave of the Fireflies. And Grave of the Fireflies is set after the Allies have firebombed Tokyo.
Yeah.
And Tokyo's just ruined.
Yeah.
The neighborhoods are ruined. There's no clean water, there's nothing. And it follows these two young children, a brother and sister, as they try to survive wandering through this firebombed city. And it's miserable. At the end of it, you'll be like, I'm never watching this again in my life, because it's so demoralizing and depressing. But, Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli generally felt like they needed to make sure that story was told, because we came out of Nuremberg telling ourselves that the bad guys were absolutely evil and the good guys were absolutely good, and we're the winners and the good guys, and so we're absolutely good. And it was important for us to understand that we didn't just have a little bit of culpability. We did terrible, terrible, terrible things.
Well, if you look at it that way, in some sense, we were worse. We were indiscriminate, right? Hitler just wanted to kill the Jews. That's limited. I mean, look, well, I'm not justifying that, by the way.
No, I know, but he did also just fire.
No, he did, but he
wasn't very discriminating.
Destroying what is necessary that stands in the way. We just carpet bomb everybody, right?
Yeah.
So
if
Hitler had won the war,
not a good one.
Right.
The Nazis employed mass destruction when they had the capability.
Okay.
The
true.
Nazis didn't have the heavy bomber fleet on the scales that the Allies did. That was
Right.
huge.
Yeah.
Right.
The American heavy bomber fleet and even the British one were quite gigantic. The Germans couldn't create, didn't have the resources to expend it.
That's right.
And I'm trying to remember, it's Kurt Vonnegut has a science fiction novel that also involves the firebombing of Dresden,
Slaughterhouse-Five.
Slaughterhouse
yeah.
Five.
Slaughterhouse Five.
Schlachthof-5.
Yes.
Okay, that was a very big, expensive movie which flopped a little in the box office, but remains a cult favorite.
Yes, and a book before it was a film. But the point is, when you read the Nuremberg transcripts, you can see the ways in which the Allied prosecutors are walking a very fine line, and it's not a straight line. They're swerving left and right to avoid whole discussions. The other thing that you can see that comes out of it that's really important, that underscores the difficulty that moderns have in adhering to any kind of coherent morality, is that after we established on theory the principle that following orders is not an excuse, we then did not reorganize our own military or police forces. We kept them, other than adding an extra clause here or there saying, yes, you should disobey an unlawful order. We then trained everybody exactly the same way we had back when we wanted them to absolutely follow all the orders. I have a friend who works, who went through a career in the Coast Guard. And she said one of the fascinating things about the Coast Guard is that the other branches of the US military were still really focused on that pre-World War II sentiment of, you follow the orders, and if you don't follow the orders, you go to the brig, right? You have to follow orders. That they really, you could go through them and not have a really clear sense that the Nuremberg trials had ever happened, other than there would be one day when they would take you aside and say, well, if it's an unlawful order, then you have a duty not to follow it. But other than that, all the rest of your training is going to be to teach you how to follow orders. She said in the Coast Guard, it was the opposite, because when you're trying to rescue people at sea, there's no there's no script or plan or set of orders that if you always follow them, you'll always rescue people. The chop on the waves, whether it's raining, whether your boat's about to collide with the boat you're trying to rescue, there's so much chaos that the focus instead is on how to work together as a team with people you've never worked with before, and how to improvise a solution out of whatever you find yourself doing. So in some ways, the Coast Guard training was the opposite of the training that exists in the other branches. And it stands out as conspicuous because that kind of principle-driven problem-solving approach is what you would expect all of the branches of the military to have adopted after Nuremberg, right? Learn the principles of justice, learn the principles of when it's right, to use force, what is a just war, and then follow the orders that are consistent with that and disobey the orders that are inconsistent. That's what we would have expected to see after Nuremberg if we'd really taken to heart those principles. But we didn't. So Kenneth Smith makes a distinction. He says, one of the things that's hard for moderns to understand is we have no principles at all. We have what we call ideals. And an ideal is a principle that has no moral force at all. You sort of want to wrap yourself in it because it sounds nice. Wouldn't it be nice if the world worked this way? From time to time, people will choose to align themselves with the ideals freely of their own will because they can. But the people who don't could just ignore the ideals whenever they want to. And so you see, we set up the UN, but then anytime the US wants to engage in a war that they think they might have to commit war crimes, we just ignore the UN. We maybe don't even pay our dues. And we can do that because we sit on the Security Council so that they can't censure us.
Wow.
Right? So the role of the UN has this quality of modernism where it's following a system more than it's following principles. We're willing to stand up principles in the form of ideals and follow them when it suits us. But when it doesn't suit us, we've designed the system to allow us to get out from underneath those ideals and do whatever it is that we think is prudent or advances our national interests. So we have all these catchphrases that we use whenever we're papering over what's basically about to be a deeply immoral and unprincipled action. Because for modernism, there's no there. There's only the system and the games we can play with it, the artificiality of it. Donald, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah. We're almost back to where I joined this group, contra Kant. Kant was trying to get I mean, I think we all have seen he didn't make it, but he's trying to get reason to a point that it can sort out these conflicts in modern reason.
Yes.
You know, and what principles can be elevated to universals, and how you go about deciding to avoid these things. I think at this point we would agree that he didn't get it done, and maybe even that it can't be done, and that it's just as well that he didn't. But I mean, he was trying to solve a real modern problem, a problem in modernity.
He was.
You know, and then he got so abstract that he lost the content. And I don't want to really discuss, my father was both a lawyer and a soldier in Europe in World War II. And he always said, Nuremberg was victors holding losers to a higher standard than they held themselves.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know, basically, I mean, I would say that probably doesn't apply to Goebbels and Goering and Himmler and Hitler, you know, the real national stuff, leaders. But below that, in the US Army or Navy, maybe not in the Coast Guard, I don't know. Yes, you can, I guess, say that an order is unlawful, but you will simply be referred to some judge advocate general who will say you don't have the knowledge to make that decision.
Exactly.
That requires a knowledge of the law and a knowledge of facts that you do not have. And so, would you like to obey the order or end up as a prisoner or whatever? And in wartime, it's probably they're not going to make you a prisoner. They're just shoot you and move on. It may be that if that's not the case, it's because our officers no longer have the strength of will to shoot their own soldiers, but they might have in World War II.
Right.
I know the unit my father was in was accused of being harsh to Germans. You know, he was in an airborne unit. They had no means of taking prisoners most times.
Right.
And how do you deal with that? Well, running out of ammunition is not cause for surrender.
Right.
That's simply bad luck. You decided to fight, and then you ran out of ammunition, and well, we're sorry. We're not going to loan you any.
Right.
But he didn't care for that because he thought we couldn't have applied it to ourselves. The rules at Nuremberg would have been, and most people, especially moderns, maybe you could have done this with Greek or Roman aristocrats, but a modern or Patrick, you know, I am going to live honorably or I'm willing to die. That's not us.
Right.
You know, we're back to catch-22, you know, live on our feet, not die on our knees. Try to, you know, how do we do that? There, you can see that maybe a Roman or a Greek would have literally fallen on their sword. The Japanese at one point would have.
Yes.
Well, yeah.
They did at one point.
Kamikaze, yeah, right.
But don't think that the United States citizenry today is going to do that.
It's the rare one.
It'd be very rare. Most people, is it death or is it Is it doing the honorable thing? The honorable thing gets you killed.
Yeah.
It's I don't know. The cultural support is not there.
Exactly.
We do not have my mother was not a Lacedemonian that said, it told me to come back on my shield or carrying it.
Right.
She told me, don't even go. You're a fool to go.
Billy, don't be a hero.
Right. So, I mean, before I call on Phil and Stephen, let me underscore what you said about Kant, because you got to think about his position in history. At that point, modernism was underway, but it was still separating itself from the medieval worldview. And the medieval worldview was based on the answers are known, and you are allowed to freely reason and think as long as you arrive at that answer. But you're not allowed to reason and think in a way that gets you to a different answer, because then you're a heretic and we burn you. One of the things I did before today's session is I reviewed the writings of Augustine and Aquinas on the use of torture and murder to bring heretics into line. And it's fascinating reading. You want to, on the one hand, praise them for the things that they said about love and about, the searching intellect, the freedom of thought. But then when you look deeper, you realize they're pro-torture, they're pro-murder, and they're pro-freedom of intellect as long as it arrives at the right answer, which means that's no freedom at all, right? That's medievalism in a nutshell. The idea is that God has given us all the answers, and now our job is to arrange our lives so that we arrive at that correct culmination point. And that's one of the things that distinguishes medieval Christianity from the early Christianity and from some varieties of Christianity that exist today. So you got to think about Kant in that framework. And what he's saying is he's saying you can't arrange things just so that they satisfy what tradition tells you the answer has to be, or what the authorities tell you the answer has to be, or what your feelings, no matter how strong they are, tell you that it should be. You have to arrange things so that they actually make sense, so that there's actually logical, coherent integrity to the whole thing. This was the Kant crisis that Kenneth Smith talks about, right? That was provoked all over Europe, is all kinds of people who thought of themselves as smart and thought of themselves as intellectual couldn't reconcile the way that they thought about the world and lived their lives with what Kant said was our basic duty as intellects. And when they tried to reconcile the two, they realized that their entire lives and societies were in conflict with it. So on the one hand, he's trying to dispel a massively corrupted form of intellectualism. And you're right that, in doing it, he was attempting to allow pure reason, noesis itself, without any other source, just noesis should be able to answer all our questions for us. And I think it's not that he failed. I think it's what you said. It's that it can't be done, because noesis doesn't give us the connection to the world that allows us to tell whether we're coming to valid conclusions or true conclusions, which are a different thing. Noesis can get you to valid conclusions, but 99 out of every 100 valid conclusions is false. Only reality can tell us which one is true. And noesis by itself has no tie to reality. You need gnosis for that. And so I guess, this is kind of what we said back when we did Contra Kant. If Kant hadn't done this, somebody else would have had to. Somebody had to try to demonstrate whether it was possible to make a civilization and a schema of morality using pure noesis, because it's an attractive nuisance. The idea is lying right there in front of us all the time. The more we in our lives rely upon thinking coherently, the more attractive and appealing it seems to us that surely if we just think our way through this enough, we should arrive at the right answer. And this is how you see in the 20th century in Star Trek, there's Spock using the word logic to apply to things that don't really have anything to do with logic. Very logical captain, which frequently doesn't mean logical at all. It means gnosis has led you, not noesis, gnosis has led you to the correct conclusion that corresponds to reality, which is a totally different question from whether something's logical. Our own confusion about how our mind works and what we mean by the word reason and all this stuff has made it so that generations of incredibly brilliant people have done futile things because they didn't know what it was that they were trying to do. They didn't understand themselves or their minds or human society enough to know what contradictions they were trying to set in motion. It's part of why a framework like this existentialist traditions framework that we get from Hegel, that we refine through Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Arendt and Smith and others, is so important, is to allow us to finally stop making those same mistakes and to understand that the mind has different faculties, and we can't demonize one of the faculties and canonize the other one and expect that we're going to come out of this sane. We got to learn how to use them both and what they're for in order to be coherent people. Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Well, if Kant is so committed to the will and reason being self-referential, wrapped around itself,
yeah,
then did he at least come to the conclusion that self-referentiality is incomplete? That, he might have said, I've done my best, but there seems to be some missing factors, some dark factors I do not understand.
Yeah.
And to the degree that I've explained what I explained, maybe that's good. You should start with that, but there's just lots of unknown factors. The cosmological constant, so to speak, that has not accounted for, and so therefore it is at best incomplete.
Yeah.
It seems to me that that reference would be a self-referential reference that he did not do, right?
He did a little bit.
Did he?
A little bit.
Okay.
He didn't do it justice.
Yeah. Okay.
But there are points in Kant where he seems to pause and go, I sure hope God is here to help fill in the missing part. Or it feels like you have to rationally choose to introduce some other things at key points to make this work. But he doesn't stress it. And it's very easy for a fan of Kant to read Kant and miss those passages where he's sort of admitting something seems to be missing.
The other thing I want to say is, about the artists who put the spotlight on the black kids. Yeah. That was a revelation, no doubt. But when it's all over, the spotlight is turned off. It's back to the way it was. I mean, the thing is, when you have the theater, it's just better if the theater had spotlights rather than just turn on the lights, everything is shown all together. Yeah. Right? And so once you have a system in which you can let whatever the power that be or the struggling power to shine spotlights here and there everywhere, it's like the ones with the bigger spotlight is going to capture the attention, right? And once again, you with your flashlight is going to be put to the background. And so therefore, once again, the black kid is way in the background. He's only got a damn flashlight on him. But the big spotlight is on the landowner and the wife and the legitimate children and so forth. So I think, isn't that what we're fighting against? Because we do like the theatricality of that.
We do. We're really indebted to how other people see us, as far as how we survive in modernism. We're when the will of the majority is hypothetically what determines the outcome, at least in some parts of our society, then you have to preoccupy yourself with how the majority sees you, and appearances become incredibly important. And the problem is that plays right into the momentum that came out of the medieval epoch, where you had this upper caste of the church hierarchy who didn't actually follow Jesus's teachings. They wanted everybody else to follow Jesus's teachings, but they themselves were very, very Benausic, very Noetic, and very focused on the system and the hierarchy and the rules and climbing the social order within their hierarchies. And they couldn't let themselves be seen for what they were, or else they'd lose the respect of the people who they were trying to convince to to follow Jesus' example. So they had to get really good at wearing a mask that said, I'm totally following Jesus' example, and then turn away the next moment to get back involved in the infighting for who gets appointed the bishop, right? There's this back and forth between the true self and the persona that's magnified in the cast of this church hierarchy, not in the lay preachers so much, but once the closer you get to Rome, the more you get into the struggle for who's going to rise and who's going to fall within the hierarchy. And we took that intact with us into the modern epoch. So it's important for us to wear the mask of human rights and to behave in a human rights oriented fashion whenever we think it will benefit us. But if we think it's in the way, then we feel perfectly comfortable taking it back off and slaughtering a bunch of peasants if that's what we need to do. There's this dualism. And the result is that when we've talked before about the problem of philosophy in the modern epoch, is that every important term has been turned inside out, which is how I've usually talked about it in the past. That's actually making it seem simpler than it actually is. Every important term has the same Jekyll and Hyde dualism, right? So, reason, what is reason? Well, we ascribe all these beautiful things to reason. We say we are a reasonable society, we are a rational society, we are a scientific objective society, and all virtues, get put into this idea of reason and rationality. But then that's not actually true. That's not how noesis works. And whenever we turn away, then our actual noesis is what's governing us, not the beautiful illusion of noesis that we're holding up as our mask. The same is true for freedom. The same is true for free will. The same is true for human rights. There isn't a philosophical term you can find that doesn't have this Jekyll and Hyde structure to it. And it makes it hard to talk about anything in a meaningful way in the modern epoch, unless we can first go through this exercise we're doing now of saying, why is it? How did we come to this point where we have this dualism on every single topic, so that we shift back and forth, we play foreground, background, and modulate back and forth between the two meanings so smoothly that we now do it unconsciously and don't even notice when we're doing it, right? So we can be at Nuremberg, we can have the Nazis on trial, we can castigate them for bombing the civilian populations, while at the very same moment, not thinking about the fact that we bombed their civilian population too, because we don't want to put ourselves on trial according to the same principles that we're holding them according to. And it's to assert that it was done cynically, to assert that it was done consciously, is to misunderstand how proficient we are at it. We're so proficient at it, we don't even know when we're doing it. It's the water we're swimming in, it's the air we breathe. This constant back and forth shifting. Stephen, go ahead.
Well, this is one of the big issues when it comes, can we establish, for example, this is the struggle the rationalists have, that they can establish beyond doubt what are the objective moral principles. And I find it's a bit sad that they don't even seem to recognise some of the problems that stand in the way. First of all, what we're dealing with, we're dealing with a tribe of apes trying to say what's moral for the entire cosmos. That's a ridiculous element. I keep on pointing this out to them, that there's a consciousness of a dog. A dog's got limited understanding. Yet they strangely assume that human reason can understand the entire cosmos, or can even has infinite potential.
Yes.
And this is a problem. Now, we have failed to bring in some aspects here. When we're talking about the rationalists, I've thought a lot about the rationalist project.
Yes. And
the rationalist project is, Newton had such a great time formulating laws of physics, and they were wonderful, and they were almost faultless, but they were so good that you could use them 99.999% of the time and come up okay.
Right.
But of course, the rationalists decided the uncharted territory of the subjective, the human, the mind subjectivity. We can have what we visualize as the natural objectivity. We can have a great time. The word rational means to measure. We can measure it and create a set of rules. We're doing pretty good there.
Right.
But they're trying to do the same thing with the mind, with the subjective, with the metaphysical. And this is where they're running into trouble. Yep, we can, to a degree, make a few rules about the mind or argue about it, or say that we can assert values which can roughly work, but we cannot calculate to a final T what morality is or anything. And most don't seem to be admitting to the difficulty here. They won't admit. They won't even admit to this dichotomy between the objective and the subjective. As far as they're concerned, that the mind is simply the uncharted territory of the new physics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No
Right.
problem, man. We'll tell you who you really are and what motives you have, and mechanically, we'll one day invent the perfect pill that makes you happy all the time.
Maybe we've done it already. You should give us your money.
And yeah, this is the thing. I've looked at rationalism. Rationalism literally means the ability to measure nature,
Yes.
but then they go on to the mind. Objective nature versus subjective mind. And it's the subjective mind that they're running into trouble. But they're filled with this belief, this faith.
It's a faith.
That the mind can be charted to the
Yes.
point now that if you deny that, you're a heretic.
Yes. Yes. And the faith defines itself circularly. Says the reason that we know we can chart it is that it's just a machine. And since it's just a machine, we can chart out all its parts and their relationships, and then we'll know how it works. But the idea that it's a machine is itself an article of faith. The Greeks never thought it was a machine. They thought it was an organism. And organisms are by nature infinite. They infinitize, they unfold new order. And so they can't be charted, right? This is like a complete contradiction of the naturalistic perspective on the mind, which is that people are full of surprises. People are constantly coming up with new things you didn't expect them to do. If people were machines and we could predict them infinitely, let me tell you, marriages would be a lot more predictable. There'd be a lot fewer divorces, right? I mean, people are full of surprises. Good.
You've got to
and
remember
bad.
the positivists in all this, which the rationalists will have as their boys.
Yes.
Oh, we'll just put down the flag. There's an A here, plonk, like the Martian
Yes.
in Looney Tunes, and Z, plonk here. We're only going to discuss what's in between those flags.
Right.
Everything
Bring in the
outside
question.
those flags is in the too difficult, and yet at the same time, they, as you point out, they have this faith that perspective
Yes.
of theirs
Yes.
can be the only perspective that ever exists. Well, it's a white swan fallacy yet again, or the black swan fallacy, as they call it. That, hey, plonk the flags down. The only thing we've ever seen anywhere is white swans. So that's a universal truth.
Let's make sure everybody knows this reference. There's a reason Stephen is bringing this example up. Until Europeans colonized Australia, we'd never seen a black swan. We thought there was no such thing. And we had a figure of speech that was widespread in Europe. When we said something that was impossible, we called it a black swan. So obviously, everybody knows there's no such thing as a black swan. So by comparing that to a black swan, ipso facto, it must be impossible, right? And then Europeans go to Australia and discover, lo and behold, the black swan of Australia. And it was a shocker. And we don't even know anymore what a shocker it was, because it was used as a figure of speech and a metaphor for everything. And they basically had to dismantle one of their core metaphors for understanding the world in light of the evidence, because it was so irrefutable. And rather than using it as a teaching opportunity and teaching every kid the idea of, how can your metaphors rule your mind until you come up with new evidence. We just sort of erased it from our history. We don't teach kids anymore that we all used to say this and think this all the time, and we were proven wrong by the world. You'd think that the most objective, scientifically driven culture of all time, like we claim to be, would cherish and love this example, but instead we suppress it. We don't talk about it because it's embarrassing to us. So anyway, I thanks, Stephen, for bringing that up, because most people don't even know about that, what happened there. So this is the challenge of modernism, is that modernism believes, as the most objective culture that has ever existed, that it has no faith. We only believe things for rational reasons. By which we mean we only believe things because they're true. Which weirdly, when you follow the circle around,
they can be demonstrated,
right?
Like physics,
right? There's a circularity to the argument that leads all the way back to ipso facto. Because we believe it, it's true, because we are the people who only believe true things, because we're more objective than anyone has ever been. So if we believe it, it's true. It goes round and round in a little circle. And anything that doesn't satisfy that gets jettisoned and completely suppressed into the background, so that we don't have to admit that, in fact, it's not true that the things that we believe are ipso facto true. There is a way in which the form of objectivity and scientism that we've adopted is just medievalism under a new mask, right? Because the orthodoxy of medievalism was, we have the right answers and don't you question them. And anyone in the modern era,
we're repeating it in a way. I'm not with what I'm getting getting from the rationalists in the last few years, that if you deny climate change as they envision it, then legal sanctions should be made against you. If you are an anti-vaxxer and disbelieve in the vaccination, then legal sanction should be, taken against you. And I think a few other modernists, rationalists, new pets on the block, but they've virtually taken up this medieval role of the church, that we'll judge what you can say and think.
Right. Well, and that is actually a very interesting example, because what it underscores is when we want people to understand what we're like, whether that's us or somebody else, we point to science. We say, see, science changes its mind when it sees new evidence. So that's who we are. We're the first people in history to be objective, because we change our mind when we see what's true. The problem is we connect economic power, economic dependencies, political power, political dependencies, laws, rules, the infliction of norms is not done based on reality. It's done based on what we currently say reality is. And we don't deal so well with the discovery that we're wrong about one of these things. Our systems don't all smoothly flow to adapt. The thing that has the more staying force, the greater staying power, is not the science, it's the coercion. The systems of coercion we're committed to. The systems of science we use when it pleases us, but not when it doesn't please us. And so there again, we get to this question of, are we really committed to principles, or do we take them on and put them off when it pleases us? And so are we really committed to changing our minds in the face of new evidence, or do we just want to think of ourselves that way and be seen that way, but are perfectly happy to behave inconsistently with it whenever there's money at stake or power at stake? So we'll come back to that. Donald, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah. One of the things that's, I think, about Kenneth's existentialism,
yes,
is the knowledge that results from it, the self-knowledge, the knowledge of our mind, our nature, comes to be through history.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like we roll over a rock and the secret of mind is written there or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
or on some stone tablets or something. It's something that we have to learn about ourselves through time. And the Greeks, if they were existentialist in the way that Kenneth is, they may not have understood that human beings could even be the types of people that were in the medieval or the modern world.
No.
No,
Outside the
so they
reference.
can't even. But we've done it. So there's new knowledge about ourselves that prevents this from sort of being all wrapped up
Right.
and neatly. We have how well knowing ourselves, as the Greeks encouraged us to do, has come through our history. We should know more about ourselves now than they did then, but we've had a great forgetting also.
Mm-hmm.
But Kenneth is trying to help us unforget, to remember,
Yes.
the Greek alethos, to come out of the river of Lethe, the forgetting, to leave the forgetting, or to undo it.
Yes.
And we should. That's why I think we've made this point time and time again. Not me, but that we can't understand ourselves until we understand more about this. And that's like I would say there are things like, not everything is new. The Greeks knew about tyrants. I think they could have understood a Hitler. Maybe the scale at which he operated was inconceivable to them, but not some of the human drives. I think they could probably understand a lot of our political failures too, but in ways, it's all historical. History doesn't end. We're all doomed. The world won't end. But it's why there's more knowledge, more knowing of ourselves that has to occur.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if we stop that process, we cease being existential and become delusional, just like you've said countless times.
Thank you, Donald. I'm going to call on Phil, and then I'm going to take us back to the text, because we've been talking around the text, but the text itself is very interesting. So Phil, go ahead, and then we'll go to the text.
Yeah, I think I need to object to what's been said, at least in part. I think there is a limitation to the mind and our perceptions and all that. And particularly with modern science being as complex as it is.
Yeah.
There's a natural, even if you want to, there's a natural lag time for you to understand what the hell they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, there's also the fact that our filters are imperfect because we exist in life and we have certain things that matter to us, and the immediacy of those things impinge on our understanding of something that's sort of more universal in a way, right? So in that sense, I think a good thing to remember is that it's not that we remember something because we didn't forget it. It's that quite often we remember something because we choose to forget about the other things.
Yes.
So there's an active part in participation in terms of memory and forgetfulness. And that active participation has something to do with the immediacies of our lives in relationship to what everything else might be. So that is a limitation of our mind, that we have this will to forget.
Mhm.
They talk
Mhm.
about like a basketball player. He missed a shot. He's good at forgetting that he missed a shot because he knows he'll make the next one. If he remembers it, it's gonna bug him, and he's gonna be nervous about making the next shot. So I mean, it's a very convoluted feedback loop that hinders the process, and that is why we need culture to help filter that out, because we're just sort of slow learners in that sense,
Mhm.
or slow rememberers, because we've
Mhm.
forgotten so many things, which we chose to forget. Some things we forget because we just forgot. Other things we actually choose to forget. So I think that lag time does explain it. Some people need like a lag time that's beyond their lifetime. So what hope is there for them? I have no idea. But that lag time is what culture, hopefully, that's operating the right way, help us through mythology and through customs or whatever to remember, oh yes, now I remember that, you know? And I think that we need to be a little bit more forgiving about the forgetfulness of others to a limit. I mean,
Mhm.
you cannot say like, oh, forget it, like I understand and just forgive everything they do. But I think so therefore we need to be reminded of our forgetfulness. Because that's part of existence too. It's because we to go on with our life, we have to forget certain things. It's too disturbing, too painful. It's like we want to chase the good memories or whatever the reasons are. So I think that is part of the human condition. And that's why human nature is not the same as nature. Because we
Yeah.
have this will to forget. So I guess I ask for forgiveness, but I hold myself responsible. I mean, like I hold myself to a fairly tough standard, and I try to be a little bit more forgiving of others, but I still hold them to a kind of tough standard. I can't just let it all go. So I think just you have to be patient. People are just slow learners.
Yeah. I've talked before about this. I'm going to bring it back up again because it's been a while. There is this book, Aspects of Death in Early Greek Art and Poetry by Emily Vermouth. And it's an unusual work because most people cite the later philosophers, but she's going back to the earlier lyric poets. When people quote the Greek poets at all, they quote the epic poets or the later tragedies. They don't quote the lyric poets very often. But her point is they should, because they don't know what they're missing. An enormous amount of the core of Greek philosophy that we think was invented by later Greek philosophers is already present in these earlier lyric poets. There are lines of Heraclitus that show up before Heraclitus is born that are in these lyric poets. And they are using art to try to understand the human condition, right? They're doing laments, they're doing, funeral orations, they're doing sometimes just beautiful poetry or sad poetry. Let me actually put the title in here. Aspects of Death in Early Greek Art and Poetry by the late Emily Vermouth. I said Petri, but of course that should be poetry. And this comes up because back up in the section under ancient, when he's introducing the ancient worldview, on the third page of that, he has a quote like generations of leaves are the children of men. He says Homer, he cites that to Homer. And later in that same paragraph, he talks about Homer's epithet for humans being ephemeroy, creatures of a day. And he quotes Pindar, saying man is but a shadow of a dream. And all that material is in this book and a lot more. And part of what's interesting about it is she talks in this book about that the lyric Greek poets are very clear about their frustrations with the human condition. They say, it is clear that there is a line between the human and the divine, because there are weaknesses to the human condition that are just deeply frustrating, and not just frustrating, they're deeply painful and inescapable. We seem stuck with them. Now, when we talk about the generations of leaves, he's talking about mortality. Homer's talking about the mortality. And, death is frustrating and painful, and we have an enormous amount of grief and organization around it. But he says another thing that distinguishes us, from the divine is our relative weakness, that there are all kinds of things we can imagine doing that could make life better, but we just lack the capacity to do them. We aren't strong enough. We can't stop a volcano. We can't stop a hurricane. We can't seem to just stop global warming. We can't, whatever it is we want to engage with, we can't just turn off a pandemic by throwing a switch. We lack the powers that we need in order to make things better. But the third factor is what the term ephemeroy is actually about. Kenneth Smith often quotes the ephemeroy side by side with the generations of leaves quote. And I always read that to mean that creatures of a day is talking about how short-lived we are. But Emily Vermouth says that's not right, that the ephemeroy quote starts with the lyric poets, and what they actually mean by it is that overnight while we're sleeping, we forget everything. And when we wake up in the morning, it's like we're starting over. All the things that we were in the middle of, that we were passionate about the day before, we might have been enraged about something, we might have been committed to something. But the next day we wake up and it's like we're a new person in a way. And we're sort of rebuilding ourselves step by step as the day goes on. And it creates an enormous problem for us, partly in achieving things, because the next day we might not be desperate to build that little house we were going to build in the back. Today we might be crazy about, cooking chicken cacciatore. And we go to the store and we buy all the ingredients, we make chicken cacciatore, and somehow we've lost a day where we didn't work on building the thing because we're a new person. Says, but the other thing is the forgetting, the enormous amount of forgetting, so that you can teach somebody something one day and they can say, I totally understand it. I'm totally there. I'm going to change my life. I'm going to focus on this thing. I'm never going to forget this again. And the very next day, they're saying the same things they did before you had the conversation with them. And you're like, why should we even have a conversation with you if you can't keep yourself coherent from one day to the next? If learning new things just slips away again. In the modern epoch, we don't like to talk about this. We talk a lot about the way that we have an infinite potential for learning, and our minds can infinitely change and take in new information. We can become new people. And it's true that capacity is present to some extent, but it seems to be present in a broken way, because all of us have had the experience, I'm sure, of having, a long argument with somebody, and you finally reach an agreement about it. You're like, okay, we're in agreement. That's great. But a day later or a week later or a month later, they're back to having the same previous position, and they don't even remember ever having agreed. Or you're the one. You find yourself slipping back to an earlier, if you have the introspective capacity, you will notice sometimes you're the one who slips back to an earlier position, even though you had previously changed your mind and come to agree with a new position. And here you are somehow on the old one. And if you try to retrace your steps, there aren't any. You just woke up one day and you were back where you started. And you're like, what the hell? What just happened? And so for that, the Greeks coined this term, ephemeroy, creatures of a day. They say the day is a tyrant over us. Sometimes we can resist the compulsion of the day and create continuity from one day to the next. but sometimes we can't, even when we were sure we could. And it is to the lyric Greek poets and to the ancient Greek philosophers, it's one of the defining characteristics of mortals that makes them mortal and not divine, that they have this faulty ability to understand things, in which forgetting and backtracking and rationalization and all these other things are all tied up in such a way that it is clear the mind is not a computer. It is not an organ that processes the truth. It's some other kind of thing. And we're trying to leverage it and get it to do this thing that it evidently was not evolved to do, because it sure doesn't do it really well. It's that's not evidently what it's for. And so it's kind of like rolling a boulder uphill like Sisyphus, or it's like running in the sand, or like building sandcastles when the tide's coming in. Some of it stays and some of it doesn't, and it's frustrating. And for this reason, the Greeks thought it was so important to always keep before every mortal the concept of what things would be like in the divine world. How do we know that we're not infinitely capable? How do we know we shouldn't endlessly praise ourselves? How do we know we should take with a grain of salt the things that we set out to do? Because this is what it would look like if we had the power to bind the future by our word. And instead we look like this. Instead we suffer these three different forms of limitation and mortality. Stephen, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say that what you're talking about was an intense experience. I gained the ability of episodic memory when I was about 5 months old. And prior to that, I didn't have the ability to perceive myself as having a past or a future. And for some months, I was stuck there every day. I wanted to be more conscious, and I was struggling to be more conscious, and I would have made progress, but there's one problem. As with babies, every time I fell asleep, the progress was wiped, sort of thing. But then when I gained an episodic memory, I could wake up. All right, where did I leave off? That faculty suddenly came into view. But one thing I noticed with the mind, I continually notice it, that beyond the conscious mind, there is slightly some sort of super mind which tends to know things somehow that our conscious mind normally doesn't know. I don't fully understand this super mind, but I realise it exists. That there is, it's like there is some sort of a mind which is beyond our normal everyday focus. But it's not something that we can manipulate consciously normally.
Right. Right. This is what the Greeks call character or soul. This idea that we might in the modern world call the preconscious or unconscious mind, that there is this enormous part of the mind underneath the surface of consciousness that's carrying forward our dreams and our memories and a lot of the products of gnosis. Much, when we engage in gnosis and we become aware of our inner landscape and our outer landscape, many of the lessons learned bypass the conscious mind and go right into the unconscious. And they set up this pattern making facility that gives us the ability, if we have a healthy gnosis, to sometimes be able to make intuitive leaps that we then rationally can't explain. How did we arrive at that conclusion? And the answer is, well, most of the work done in the mind is not available directly to the conscious. The conscious mind is just a little bit of calculation on top of this great wellspring of experiences and memories and dreams and hopes and patterns. The argument seems to be, if we're seeing this right, terrifyingly, the argument seems to be we wouldn't be able to do noesis at all if it weren't for this giant bonus of unconscious products of gnosis that had built up this critical mass within us.
Well, one thing I know about the conscious mind is it's wrapped up in the things people want.
Yes.
This other mind, not in the same way.
It goes beyond that, right?
yes, the normal mind tends to be wrapped up in the short-term ambitions for desires.
Right.
And this is a thing. I look at history, for example. World War II ends, the UN's there, and they're all flapping around thinking, no, we have all the answers. We'll find them.
Mm-hmm.
And a few decades later, and what we're seeing, that the motives of the human being, even things we class as good and evil, are bigger than we imagine. It's like this conflict which is arising in the Western world between Donald Trump's followers and the Democrats, the populists and the Democrats. People cannot grasp that this conflict is arising. I think, oh, it's just going to go away. They can't absorb the idea that look, I was there in the 1960s, man. It's all peace and love. Well, why hasn't that eventuated? Where did we go wrong? Why did the world suddenly go from hippiedom to such extreme, gross materialism? The hippies accuse their own parents of being materialists, and then a decade later, it become materialists on the scale their parents could have never imagined.
The course of history is bizarre.
This is the thing. People, they got this idea that there is, in regards to world conflict, there's something bigger moving there, either in the supermind or in the instincts, which is a bit beyond what the conscious mind understands. And when people turn around and say this conflict between the popularists and the Democrats or anything, oh, that's wrong and that should just go away.
Right.
Sorry, you've only got a minuscule bit of the picture there.
Exactly. And with that minuscule bit of the picture, the way that we use our noesis encourages us to be willful and to try to impose our little caricature of reality onto reality, to say, well, I think it should be like this. I think this was supposed to happen. Maybe I can force it to happen. I can just compel you all to be who I wanted you to be instead of who you actually are. There is this way in which, as moderns, we have been so trained into taking things to be the way that we envision them rather than the way they really are, that we overestimate our ability to shape reality merely through acts of will and through, organized acts of will. It causes us to, well, this is what Nietzsche talked about when he said power makes stupid. He says the problem with power is it leads you to think that you don't need to pay attention to what's actually going on anymore, right? If you have power, it acts as a shortcut. I'll just impose my solution. And with the power, you seem to be able to do that for a while. But because you're not paying attention, you don't see what it was you misunderstood about the situation to begin with, because you're wrapped up in your power instead of your gnosis. And as a result, the downside...
All the happy chemicals are doing pretty good in the brain, thank you. I'll keep up with my trip of self-destruction.
Yes. And when we impose the solution, it sets other things in motion, right, that aren't good, that weren't part of what we wanted. There are consequences that get rolling, and we don't notice them because we don't watch for them, because when we're in power mode, we're not observant. We're imposing rather than observing. And so we don't even know the full consequences of the actions we've taken when we do these things.
We're Hitler in the bunker.
Yes. Yes.
Shot up on drugs.
Yeah. I mean, effectively, the feedback loop of exercising the will and seeming to get what you want, it's a drug addiction. Right? It's the noetic, the naive noetic cycle, the incestuous finitizing noetic cycle is an addiction. It seems to provide all the answers, and it seems to provide all the strategies that we need going forward.
Okay, the incestuous mind, we're bringing up Oedipus here.
In a way, yeah, certainly that's part of what Kenneth Smith says Oedipus is about.
But that seemed to me to be the tragedy of Oedipus. Wasn't so much the actual physical incest.
Right.
I think the Greeks there's subtlety there that was trying to point out to the incest of the mind. Believing your own truths is blindness. Oedipus was blind because he only saw Had beautiful eyes. He was this perfect Greek man. Beautiful vision compared to the blind Tiresias. And Tiresias is saying, why can't you see what's obvious? You've got good eyes, and yet you're blind to what you don't want to see.
Yes. This is there's a Heraclitus quote about this. Eyes and ears make poor witnesses to men having barbarian minds. You know, if you have the kind of mind that wants to take things in isolation out of context of their natural setting, then you're going to misunderstand everything you see and misunderstand everything you hear. And here's Oedipus cut off from his own past. Going to what Donald said, Oedipus is a man who doesn't know his own history. And because he doesn't know his own history, he doesn't understand any of the things around him, even the things that he thinks are straightforward. And so by misinterpreting them, he then takes the wrong action time after time after time. We human beings are dangerous when we're disconnected from our context, when we don't know our history. Phil, and then I'm going to go back to the text. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, you keep saying you go back to the text. I'm sorry that I interrupt you from going back to your text. But, you know, I'm going to tell you like a kind of personal story that kind of relates to this.
Please.
I don't know if I'm tied to history. I think I'm tied to culture, or at least symbols of culture more. And this particular episode kind of demonstrate that. I used to at one time collect rocks because, you know, partly because I'm an artist and I'm interested in and fascinated by the patterns that they make. And I found this rock that seemed like there was a pattern of like, specifically something like cherry blossoms or plum blossoms. I don't mean in a very realistic way,
Right.
but in a way that like you might paint with a brush painting that's sort of like impressionistic and so forth.
Yeah.
And I decided to give it to this gal that I knew. And I was really caught between whether I should present it as representing cherry blossoms and plum blossom because they look very much alike.
Right.
Okay. And it seems to me cherry blossoms was tied to more of a Japanese culture, symbol of Japanese culture. And plum blossoms tie more to Chinese culture.
Mm.
And what the cherry blossom does is represents the fugitive nature of existence, that we are just floating by and things come and go. And there's a certain kind of melancholy about that existence that is passing, but there's also a certain kind of beauty about appreciating the transitory nature of the passing. So I'm actually very in love with that idea because it's caught up in this sort of like sense of time that's sort of transitory but present, and it's tied to memories and other things that's ethereal.
Yes.
The plum blossom, strangely enough, is a blossom that blooms when winter has not even ended. So quite often you will see it blooming through the snow. So it almost seemed to represent the promise of the future of possibilities that's awakening to the potentiality of what is to come. They're very, very different views. So despite the fact that they're kind of both confusion to a certain degree, there's an underlying, I suppose, cultural dynamics that's very different. And I didn't know what to do. So I explained to her both philosophies, because I literally could not decide, because it just seemed like it could represent both, and I like both, right? So it seems to me like that's something has to do with the fact that you have something that could symbolize something, but it's ambiguous in terms of what it could symbolize in a deeper way. I suppose it's tied to history, but it's more solidified in history in a cultural tradition that people almost live by. So that's kind of interesting, and it's sort of fascinating that I was perplexed by that question more than, let's say, well, first of all, throw away, it's just a damn rock. Otherwise, like, why even bother, like. So I think the fact that you have this sort of eye for, or this caring for something that's unusual, that inspire you to see something beyond what it actually is. It's just a damn rock with some spots on it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's kind of important, because
Mm-hmm.
it transports you into this other space that is not just about this world, but they coexist.
Yes.
And I think it's important for us to understand that there are these signs that represent other things
Yes.
that you could pass into another way of seeing another world, another
Yes.
tradition.
Yes.
And I think too often in contemporary life, more and more so, we're so wrapped up in what is actually there that in a sense we forget all the possibilities
That's
of
right.
other dimensions. And I think that's important to understand, because otherwise we all caught up too much in chasing after the presence of something, the immediacy of the thing itself. And we begin to understand, it's interesting. Heidegger says something that's somewhat mystifying. It almost counters what I say in some sense, but I think he's right. The curiosity is attracted to the immediacy of the surrounding. And so therefore it doesn't really pay attention. Oh, look at that. Look at this. Look. Like, in order to really understand something, you have to pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
And go beyond just mere curiosity, maybe
Yes.
a curiosity to examine it further. And I think that was a really different insight than what I thought, well, curiosity, right? That's good. But on the other hand, you have to go beyond the dances of curiosity that's constantly bombarding you.
Right.
And that is very susceptible to spectacle.
Yes.
It's like, whoa, how exciting. Look, there goes the clown. And I think that's part of the things you have to understand, is that you have to search for the thing that actually inspires you to another dimension. And I think that's what a lot of people lose, particularly in the marketing culture, because it sort of captures your attention, like, you got to have this, and they're very good at making that attractive enough that you are distracted from what the reality should be in terms of other dimensionality. So I just thought I'd throw that in terms of, existence and time.
Thank you, Phil. There's a little Pindar to wrap us up on this part of the discussion. That's one of the lyric poets, and thing of a day, that's Ephemeroy. That's a translation of Ephemeroy. So this is a reference to that whole, the difficulty of the human condition that we've been talking about. So from this, I want to go into the modern section, and I'm not going to actually start with the first paragraph or the opening sentences of the second paragraph, because we've talked about those a lot when we've talked about what the ancient and the medieval epochs are about. We've talked about Pico della Mirandola. We've talked about how different the modernist conception of a human being is But to get to kind of the heart of it, partway through the second paragraph, he talks about man was by design formed to be irresolute, not determinate, but merely determinable. A sheerly potential being, an isometric creature in whom there's no natural or spiritual bias in any specific dimension. Now, this is like a tabula rasa, right? We could be anything. Is core to Pico della Mindola's myth that he's putting together for the modern age. He's saying we are not trapped by nature, we are not trapped by God, we are just infinite potentiality itself made flesh, and that as a result, the focus for us is our omnipotential, according to Pico. That we have, all the other animals are better at something than we are, but we have the seeds of all the other animals within us. We could be any of these things if we develop ourselves in that direction. And so what's important about us is that freedom, that what Pico's doing is, remember the way that the early Christian conception of God won the debates with the ancient conception of God by saying your gods, by being gods of parts of nature, are bound by the hule, the matter, the lawfulness of that matter that they are gods of. But our God pre-existed all matter, and so he wasn't bound by any hule. He could do anything he wanted to. All the things that your gods couldn't do because the matter wouldn't allow them to, our God can do all those things, in addition to all the things that your gods can do. And therefore our God is greater, and you should give up your God and worship our God. Right? That was the theological argument that was used during the late ancient epoch, going into the modern. And you see what has happened here when Pico is saying it is now human will that could go in any direction, that is not bound by the matter of human character, because Pico's saying there is no matter, there is no nature, there's no lawfulness of human character, right? That human character, by being a tabula rasa, allows the God that is ourselves to author anything we want to out of ourselves without any constraints. When we've talked before, I know people have thought maybe I was being metaphorical when I summed up Kenneth Smith as saying that the modern epoch overthrew the medieval God, who had in turn overthrown the ancient nature gods, and in so doing deified the human will. I think people were thinking that Kenneth Smith speaking metaphorically about deification. But what we see in this is that literally the core advantage of the medieval God has been taken away from the medieval God and placed inside the human mind, as the human will is now free of all material constraints in shaping the human being to be anything he wants to make of himself. It is literally the theology of the medieval God taken away from them and given to our mind, right? That God has not limited our potential in some way that we have to obey. We have infinite potential. And nature has not limited our potential in some way we have to obey. Both of them have been cast aside. And now the mind itself is omnipotent to shape its future. Thus, we can say why Jefferson feels confident inscribing inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Freedom, which previously had to be fought for your whole life, like Sisyphus pushing a boulder up a hill, you now get it for free because Pico said so. We're just born infinitely free, right? This is a 100% inversion of the old positions about the nature of the human mind and human character and what our possibilities were. Where the lyric poets are so frustrated with the intractability of the human animal, whenever it tries to liberate itself, it keeps finding itself chained back to old positions and returning to them, like an animal going back to the barn not knowing why. Pico saying, no, that doesn't happen. Not at all. We're free. We can do whatever we want. You don't have to work for it. It's just yours. This is a huge change, right? So when now I'm going to go back to the opening sentence. He says the modern order defined its origination by a radically different modus, a way of arising and cohering that was neither natural nor divine. Radically different, all the way down to the roots, to the foundations of the conception of what it is to be human, what it is to be natural, what it is to be divine. The modern order changed the definitions of all three of those things. And as part of its rejection of the power of the medieval structures, it had to strike for the throat. It had to cut the feet out from underneath the very foundations of the medieval way of seeing the world. And that included the vestiges of the ancient way of seeing the world that the medieval order had carried forward. Those also got the legs cut out from under them. The whole thing was upended. So thus, we end up with man is defined by his openness to self-definition, his distinctive willfulness or arbitrarial will. Man alone seems to be a radically artificial creature, the work of his own will, and he is necessarily also his own architect or legislator of his own laws. Now, from the ancient perspective, this is just ridiculous. This is impossible. This might be something you'd put in the mouth of some comic character who believed this about himself, right? And then the rest of the comedy would be showing all the ways in which he's bound by nature and bound by the gods, even while he's denying that it's happening, right? The satyr play about the Cyclops, who thinks that he doesn't owe anything to the gods. He's spouting modernist positions and being mocked for it. And also, we're seeing him as this terrible being. But in the modern world, instead of that being a comedy or a tragedy or a horror, it's going to become glory. We're going to say that's the best possible thing to believe these things. This is what it is to be modern, endowed by his creator with certain inalienable rights, which he just has. And the notion that not being bound by nature or God, the only thing left that matters is what, as an artificer, as a creator, he artificially creates. The artificiality of modern nomoi systems that we organize ourselves according to is not a coincidence. It derives directly from the belief that that's why we exist. That's, as an animal, this is our, according to Pico, this is our distinctive power. Unlike all the other animals, we can will whatever we want, and therefore we must exercise that will. We must shape the world and we must shape ourselves, because nature, according to the modernist dogma, nature isn't going to do it for us and God isn't going to do it for us, and neither is anything else. So it falls to us. We must engage and change everything to put our fingerprints on it, to make a human world and to make a human personality of ourselves. So this is the opening, this notion of a vacuum, a virtual cosmos with no constraints in which the will can exercise itself to do whatever it wants to do, and that it needs to do that. It must change. And thus, you can see how this goes hand in hand with a discussion we had with Richard Lamb maybe 4 months ago, where he talked about the way that to a modern, a forest has no value until it's cut down and converted to lumber. When it is being used, when artifice is being imposed upon it, it acquires a modernist value, because only the will and its artifacts are valuable. Things in and of themselves are worthless. Nature has no meaning. The gods have no meaning. Only the acts of will and the choices of will have meaning. If a tree falls in a forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? To a modern, the answer is obviously no, because nothing important could be happening without a human being there to process it and make it important through the act of applying our will to it. The will blesses it with our willfulness, thereby giving it a value. Nietzsche, of course.
Than animals. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say this makes us worse than animals. I mean, in a sense, like it makes us lesser. And well, I didn't mean to blurt that out.
Sure, but in order to create that evaluation, you have to step outside the modern order, because according to the modern order, it's all self-enclosing. And so, who are you to judge our willfulness, which is inherently divine? You can't, right? Modernism doesn't allow that. So by questioning this, you're doing a very contra-modern thing. Not that I'm opposed to that, but yeah. So there, heretic, outsider, you must be shunned. Let's see. Phil's got his hand up. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I remember maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago when we discussed this topic just briefly. I mentioned how brilliant Pico was in terms of this idea.
Yes.
That changed everything. But also I mentioned Michelangelo.
Yes.
Which came very close to that time.
Yes.
So early modern, about his late sculptures, which I admire very much more than even
emerging
his
from
sculpture.
the stone.
Emerging from the stone, and I feature the struggle to be okay. So that's good so far. But now I'm going to mention the other part. They never liberated themselves from the stone.
Right.
Right. This is important. We did not put the focus on the other part, the background. So he was in some ways a modern, but he was also a heretic because he was like,
yes.
No, the stone has still got you.
Yes.
It's not as if like he didn't know how to do it because he had Cobb David and everybody else,
sure,
the Pietà, and they were liberated from the stone, right? So he did it purposely. Yeah. So that meant something. That meant something. He was also saying this is a good thing, but be cautious because you are still from the stone. And so I think I think Michelangelo is just a brilliant artist. There's no doubt about it. I went to the Sistine Chapel and I saw it and it's like just blew me away. And right next to the Sistine Chapel was Raphael's painting of the School of Athens.
Yes.
And I said to myself, Michelangelo is a better painter than Raphael, which is a whole lot to say because everybody worshiped Raphael, right?
Yeah.
And Michelangelo is not a painter; he's a sculptor.
Yes.
Right. To be able to say that a sculptor is better painter than the preeminent painter. The pre-Raphaelites.
But he's got that sculptural approach to painting. He really creates that.
It's just the power of the work and how it filled the gap. It's like he's just an amazing artist, I don't know if there's anybody equivalent to him, even though I'm a modernist, I still worship his works so much. So I think it's important to note that he never really liberated himself.
Yeah.
A footnote that I said Kant didn't do.
That's right.
Right? And he did it.
So, that's the thing is, if we talk about the emergence of an epoch, in the early stages of an epoch, they haven't yet purified themselves. Mm-hmm. And so you're finding forms of the new epoch's ideology that are deeply intertwined to a degree that the people themselves could never hope to separate them with the previous epochs, and often with earlier epochs, which have made an uprising as part of the rebellion against the previous epochs. So it's not a coincidence that the Renaissance was looking back to ancients, because they could see retrospectively the struggle between the ancients and medievalism. And so as part of their own rejection of medievalism, they brought back up that old struggle. And so it's not a coincidence you get a three-way mesh of ideologies in the mind of somebody like Michelangelo, because he's carrying a lot of medievalism with him because he's early modern. He's rejecting a lot of it in a modern sense, but he's also rebirthing parts of the ancient, ethos and trying to merge them into some kind of whole. Those periods produce artists and thinkers who are just, they're incandescent for centuries to come, because the ferment of crossing the boundaries between epochs the way that they do, and putting together things that later no modern would dream of putting together in exactly that way if they hadn't had that example. It's really exciting, right? And you see the same kind of thing happen at the end of an epoch, when people are struggling to get out of the epoch that has become corrupt and that's falling apart. Again, they start looking for alternatives. Again, they start hybridizing with these different epochs and perspectives on the world. And it's the middle period that's so dull. As when the epoch is at the acme of its powers, it's flourishing, it is purifying itself and suppressing all the heretics, and the mainstream is just what they imagine it to be. And yet it's not justified the way they think it's justified, because they are no longer pushing off against the previous epoch. And so they can't see their own threadbare nature, even as they're at the height of their powers. It produces the dullest, the purest, simplest, cleanest, most ideological works. Donald, and then Dave. Go ahead, Donald.
Well, first I wanted to ask Phil about Rodin, where the subjects appear to emerge from the bronze ingot.
Yes.
Is that not a more modern view on emerging from the stone, which is something of nature, versus emerging from what's man?
No, Rodin is a great sculptor too, but not as great as Michelangelo. I mean, no. He's really a follower of Michelangelo. So yeah.
But and the other, since one of the authors that Kenneth has mentioned somewhere in what we've read is Richard Mitchell, who writes, and he has a wonderful thing where he combines the school of Athens with the taxonomy of education to come up with a little discussion on Aristotle as the master of those who remember previously learned information. And go on.
Richard Mitchell, you're talking about the guy who wrote The Graves of Academe and The Leaning Tower of Babel. Yeah. I'm
muted, yes. But yeah, he's got an essay on that's really good, of Aristotle and Raphael's painting on the steps there, and there's Socrates and Plato, and he says the master of those who remember previously learned information, which is the definition of knowledge or knowing from the contemporary taxonomy of education.
Thank you, Donald. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. I regret I don't have the background that you've been talking about, but it's been a very interesting discussion, so I've been following along. But I did have a couple of things I wanted to contribute to get my money's worth out of it today. Referencing the tree that falls in the forest, speak as an engineer, I might be tempted to put a tape recorder out in the forest.
Right?
Event. So there might be a sound there, but
that's right.
I'm just grasping at straws here. But the other thing I wanted to say was comment on what I was fond of, I think, saying that we all have infinite potential as humans, and we can just go in any direction. And I agree with you. I'm jealous of the bird, and if I want to fly, I can go up to the airport and I can fly. And if I want to be a fish or a whale, I can, register a thing on a submarine and go underwater. And if I am jealous of a jaguar running, I think 55 miles an hour, something like that, about the fastest animal, I can buy a equal or similarly named car and go about 56 or 57. So I hear what you're saying in a generality.
Yes.
But the point I want to make is that some people have gifts.
Yes.
I have a dear friend who's a Army veteran of the post 9/11 era, came back and he was troubled or whatever, and he decided he wanted to start painting. And he's been painting a couple of years, and it's obvious he's a genius. He's very talented. And I'm a musician. I play in a college or community band, and there was a guy playing Rhapsody in Blue along with us. He'd been playing for about 2 years. And I had a lady friend who was a church organist. I was a dear friend of mine. I think she'd been playing 30 years and she wouldn't dare touch it. So as I said, some people have gifts. Oh, and I want to talk about Piaget, child development. And he would give these children who had not had an education and not been experienced or exposed to these tricks, like optical illusions. And every child would give exactly the same incorrect answer. So to me, as an engineer, they're born with firmware.
Right.
And I would claim that I think some of us have firmware for these gifts. And I don't know if you can trace this through DNA, the parentage, or the time of day, or what hospital they're born in, or whatever. But I would just say we all have a lot of opportunities, but I would say not identical. But
I agree. Yeah, and that's an example of the sort of thing that the ancients knew, and people in the Renaissance knew, but during the heyday of modernism, especially around the era of Skinner, especially the extreme behaviorists, they believed that they could shape any person into anything. With the proper conditioning, they could make anyone an astronaut or a painter or a musician or what have you. And that was sort of the pinnacle of the belief in modernism. That they believed the Pico della Mirandola myth, that we have infinite potential. But every day since then has just reaccumulated more scientific evidence that that myth is a myth. It's just not true. That like you say, people are born differentially. We have different combinations of skills, different predilections, that skills that come easily to us, predilections for those skills, different gifts, if you will, and that this is what the Greeks called natural character, that we are born with some combination of things that gives us the character we start out with. Now, granted, we have the ability to cultivate or not cultivate those gifts. If you take someone who could be this brilliant artist and you throw them into the military, if they stay there forever and they never get the chance to find out, then the world never finds out that he's got those gifts. But he does anyway, even though the culture is failing to explore, what he could be doing and then guide him towards the thing that he could be best at.
That's a big sin of our society, that we need to find a way to find these gifts that people have, because you're right. 99% of us go through life and never find our gift, right?
Right, exactly. And if we had a healthy culture, then childhood, among other things, would heavily involve that layer of experimentation, trying things to find out where do your gifts lie, what could you be really good at. But instead, our focus is on how can we make money off of you, which track can we put you on that'll be the most profitable for other people.
On standardization, the school
standardization, yes. I may have said that Skinnerianism and less him and more the other behaviorists was a pinnacle of the Pico della Mirandola myth. But honestly, the modern American educational mania for standardized tests is another pinnacle of modernism. The belief that we should all be tested on the same things and we should all rise to the same level at all those things, and that people shouldn't be different from each other. That they shouldn't have different gifts is just, yeah, that's another expression of that same myth sort of turned around. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm a little bit more cynical than that. I think beyond the fact that everything is equal, there's even a more urgent need, is that we have to downsize the minds because we need workers. Now, the day will come when we will need less workers. Then what are you going to do? I mean, like, are you going to say, well, we don't need you anymore. Why don't you just go away and die? Here's some rat poison. I mean, at some point, I think that there actually is a suppression going on, that we don't want to develop this skill because we want to train you to do what's necessary to keep the economy functioning. that's actually, to me, a more cynical thing than, let's say, we actually don't care. Like everybody's equal. Let's just do the standardized thing. That almost seems neutral compared to this other thing, right?
Yes, that's right. That part of what happens over the course of any epoch is that the value proposition that launches the new epoch at some point turns completely inside out, while believing that it's true to its original founding principles. And that's because it doesn't understand what its own founding principles are. And so the same myth that can be used to justify infinite potential can eventually be used to justify everybody should be exactly the same. We should stamp them all out of a mold. Because once you get rid of the notion that human beings each have their own character, their own set of inner laws, then to say they can all be different is just the flip side of the coin from saying they can all be the same, right? Both involve the belief that we can artificially mold them into whatever we want them to be, which of course, as any parent will tell you, who's had more than one kid, is absolutely not the case. In fact, many parents who've had only one kid will tell you it's absolutely not the case, that you can stamp them out. You can't make little clones of yourself. You can't make them all, be the person that you wish that you'd been. You pretty much can help them to grow and develop into whoever it is they were going to become. And that's about it. You could try to help them become the healthier version of themselves, but you can't craft them like a creator, because as we discover over and over, human beings each have their own lawful character. And it's profound what that character drives us to do and allows us, what it makes easy for us and what it makes hard for us. So, we have this tension in the modern epoch between, on the one hand, we want to believe that we're the first scientific civilization in the history of the world, and that we would absolutely believe what science tells us. So you will find people who say, well, yeah, science says we have differential potential, so therefore it's the modern belief. It must be inherent to modernism to believe that we have all this potential. But on the other hand, we also ignore the science whenever the science is inconvenient. And so we find ourselves caught between, well, which is it? Are we saying that human beings have a character that they inherit, and that each person's character is a strong influence in what's hard or easy for them, as science sometimes tells us, like with cycles of alcoholism? Does it run in families? Are there families where you can drink and it's fine, it's just alcohol, and there's other families where you can't even touch a drop or else it takes you over? Is it that? Or is it the case that we're all the same and we could be anything we want to, or we can all be the same? Which is it? And it going back to Stephen's very first post in this chat, it can't be resolved within the framework of modernism. All we do is infinitely reverberate back and forth between these artificial positions, because we've disconnected our design for civilization from nature. And since it's disconnected from nature, it all just turns into an argument. Who has the best argument at the moment? Who has the most votes at the moment? Who has the most money at the moment? It sways back and forth without ever resolving anywhere, because it's disconnected from the reality that should serve as a foundation. I posted the link to Proteus because Kenneth Smith often cites the Greek god Proteus as the unconscious inspiration for Pico della Mirandola. His idea of a human being who could be anything, who's not limited in any way. This mimics the Greek myth of Proteus, who was a sea god who could change his form into anything. There's a couple of Greek heroes who have wrestling matches with Proteus and try to hang on to him as he becomes one thing, then another thing, then another thing. And you see this imitated in fantasy films sometimes, where the hero's hanging on to somebody who's shifting shape. Even in the pilot for Star Trek, the original Star Trek, The Cage, Captain Pike is hanging on by the neck to one of the Talosians, and a Talosian changes shape several times before finally relenting. This is mimicking that notion. The Talosian in his illusions as being like Proteus, who can literally change his shape. So we think, when we don't think too clearly about it, we think the default thing that Pico della Mirandola taught us to think, which is that there are no limits to our character or our personality, and we could learn anything we want to or be anybody we want to be. Be all that you can be, said the army, recruiting slogan that we all heard so many times on television. It's a modern proposition, and it's why we are so anti-philosophical. It's why modernity is the least philosophical of the three epochs that we have available to study, because there's no point in knowing yourself if the answer is obvious. If you are born infinitely free and able to be anything, why bother looking, right? There's nothing to know. You're a tabula rasa. It's only if your choices in life are heavily constrained by what's inside you that you have an obligation to look at what's inside you to figure out what your range of choices actually is. It's only if you believe in a naturalistic character that gnothi seauta, know thyself, becomes a mandate for us. All of the things that drove on the late stage Greeks to engage in philosophy are missing from our conception of man, nature, and God. And so there's no real reason to look. There's no profit in it. It's just a waste of time. Time you could be spending, having fun or making money, and instead you're gonna waste it coming to a conclusion we already know. Look, it says right there in the.
We haven't mentioned the madman today.
Oh
Nietzsche's
yeah, please do.
Madman. It says, "Don't you guys realize what's happened when you've gotten rid of God? Even if I agree with you, you're not in happy land, guys. The world has become infinitely complex.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's no God to back you up anymore.
Right. And no nature either. Right? In the modern conception of the world, even nature is not binding on us. So we've got nothing. It's just a great howling abyss. The one that he warned us, gaze not into, because it gazes also. He's like, it was Nietzsche, probably more than any previous philosopher, who said as directly and uncompromisingly as possible that we have the entire modern epoch is an experiment of nihilism that believes that it's about anything but nihilism, believes it's about freedom, believes it's about human rights, believes it's about objectivity, but it believes all those things in the absence of any actual foundation. And when you scratch the surface, you can see why it is that we keep waffling on whether or not people have human rights, on whether or not NDAs are legit, on whether or not bombing civilian populations is a crime or just prudent. We can't make up our minds about these things because we have no foundation.
I'm still struggling with the existentialist nausea.
Go on.
Oh, well, this is the thing. This is the later existentialists, the French ones, and they make a very good point there. There was a couple of novels on nausea. That's suddenly when you realise you've grown up to a certain point, and it's not like a kid who thinks everything's great. You suddenly wake up one day as an adult. There are apparently things which are unresolvable.
Right.
There's a pace of life which is not going to go in the direction that you see good and fit. And your reaction to it is a feeling of sickness, of nausea. The world has made you sick. This is not the optimistic state of a child. And this is something that, your existential philosophers go on about, that how do we deal with the sense of nausea when we suddenly realise one day that our personal fate is not our own wishes, and personal desires aren't necessarily mirrored in nature or mirrored in those of a God.
Yes. Yes.
You haven't felt nausea in your life, Rick, over the nature of mankind.
Of course I have, many times.
Okay.
In fact, I'm feeling it right now. You're right. And the French existentialists talk about it. Nietzsche talks about it. Kierkegaard wrote a whole book about it and talks about it extensively. Kierkegaard, building upon Hegel's conception of the psychology that derives from the bicameral mind with the three different modes of thinking, he critiqued, I think for the first time in that level of depth, the way in which the very liberation from his own irrational drives that makes the poetic personality, the poetic side of the aesthetic personality, come to life, also creates a dizziness and a disorientation. At the height of his powers to reason about the world. He is at the nadir of his power to understand why anything is worth doing. How do I choose between one thing and another thing? If I'm disconnected from my feelings and I'm disconnected from nature and I'm a creature of perfect will, then nothing matters anymore. And
we could build more shopping malls.
right? I mean, the answers all start to become absurd, right? How can I and this is where Nietzsche says, man would rather will the void than be void of will. Once we've become addicted to using our will to solve every problem, we stop looking for deeper reasons, for deeper understanding, and we start making the will itself seem to be the answer to all problems. And we do that because if the moment we stop exercising our will and look around, we realize we've internally evacuated ourselves of the ability to form a whole with the larger world.
I disagree with a monetary system which constantly enables people to build shopping centres and malls that they don't need.
Yes.
It creates a wasteland. When there isn't a person there or people that want that thing, really want that thing, okay, they man the ship, they make it alive. But when you start building great ocean liners, which the only fate of is just to sit in port and rot. And this is what the modern economic system is doing. It's been doing it in China, building cities that nobody lives in.
Yes. Yes.
We're doing it all over the world on a scale which hasn't been done before.
Mm.
You've looked at Rio de Janeiro versus Brasilia. Have you guys seen the story of these two cities in Brazil and what happened with them?
Oh, okay, yeah. One was the natural creation, in your
Rio.
you might say, and one was the artificial creation.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So Rio de Janeiro grew up the way that cities normally grew up, naturally following paths. And the layout was a mess. The city was full of vitality, but the layout was a mess. So when Brazil was thinking about, well, we want to be a modern nation with a modern government, and we want to do proper planning, they properly planned the city of Brasilia to be the capital. And they laid the whole thing out in a very well logical, rational way. And the city's dead. It's so artificial. Nothing that needs to be next to it, the other thing, for organic reasons, is next to it. They're all separated into little categories.
Hey, stop. That's the rationalist paradise.
I know, right? The rationalist paradise is Brasilia that nobody wants to live in. They all want to live in Rio where, where there's this lively scene and music and culture and all that. But
Stephen, I have to tell you, your wasteland about malls, just so on point. I so agree with you, Stephen. Thanks for making that statement. I love that.
Well, I'm a hard money man. I'm a believer in the gold standard, and people say, oh, look at this wonderful monetary system that we can create money out of thin air. Then we can give it to the banks, and then they can go and employ people by building shopping malls that nobody wants. This is lunacy to me.
Well, I don't know about nobody wanting it. Plenty of people still do go and use the malls, don't you think?
There have been shopping malls which didn't live much of a life and are now being torn down. I just think of the waste, and this is coming out from the lips of people who talk about carbon emission. Those very same people that say, oh, we've got to stop this carbon emission. Meanwhile, let's go and build a few more shopping malls. Even me, as the ardent capitalist, starts to think, hey, why don't you hang back a bit here? Maybe we don't need to build too many more shopping malls. Practice some restraint.
This is Nietzsche in action, right? This is Nietzsche saying, once you have the power to make shopping malls, once you create for yourself an economic system in which your wealth comes from creating more shopping malls, it seems natural to you to just roll out more shopping malls forever so that you can just get richer and richer forever, regardless of whether anybody actually needs the specific mall in question. So Walla Walla, Washington built a big mall just outside the town, and it did succeed in killing all the mom and pop businesses in town.
Yeah,
but then it died because it was not actually doing anything anybody really wanted. So the net effect of this mall wasn't even a zero sum, it was a negative sum. It crashed the economy of Walla Walla, and they've never really recovered from that. Phil and then Donald. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, was it yesterday? No, I think the day before yesterday. It was no, day before yesterday. I was in the Heidegger meeting about being on time, and there was something I agree with, but I had a sneaking suspicion as related to what you're talking about. That's the idea of thrownness, that we're thrown into this sort of whirlpool of things that repeats.
Yes.
And we don't know what the hell we are, and we're trying to figure it out.
Yes.
And while that may seem irritating, it also seems like that's just the way it is. You have to deal with it. That's the life we have. To deny it is wishful thinking or some kind of nostalgia for something else. And that the way you deal with it is to keep interpreting the whirlpool that you're in, which is the hermeneutic circle, right? And this is the acceptance of where you are, and that's all that could be in the horizon.
Yeah.
Of your horizon. Okay, I'm irritated by that, but I accept that. But I just have this funny feeling that this whirlpool at the center of it, beyond the event horizon, is the black hole.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, why does Heidegger not mention that there's a horizon and there's an event horizon and there is a black hole? What happens at that when you enter into the black hole? I mean, that to me is unsettling, even if you accept, well, I guess we're trapped in the same thing, like we're in this whirling dervish of the galaxy, and eventually we will cross the event horizon. I mean, I guess maybe you're gonna keep busy and try to build satellites to go to Andromeda or wherever, or else you just say, well, let's make the best of it because that's what we are in, and let's not get so caught up in the event horizon to the degree that we can't even be where we are now, which in some ways is even worse because you're denying everything. Okay. And so I just have that sneaky feeling that we are caught. And I mentioned this because that seems like what modernity is caught in, as you put it, is that we don't pay enough attention to the black hole that's beyond the event horizon.
Yeah. In it, Kenneth named his second book of parables Webs. He wanted to talk about the way that ideologies capture our minds. And we think that we are exercising our free will when we think the thoughts in our mind. We think no part of us is freer than our own mind, that it's the most distinctively ours. Our thoughts are our thoughts. And we really don't grapple with the truth that almost everything that goes through our minds came from somewhere else. And it wasn't ours at all. And a lot of it was manufactured for us, not to make us healthy, but in order to make us useful to somebody else. There's an enormous amount of what we consider our most private inward self that actually is just mass market commodity. So he used the word webs at first to try to capture this idea. But the more he thought about it, the more he thought, that's too limiting. It doesn't show the way in which we're not just passively caught, but that we're actually engineering our trap while believing that we're escaping it. And so he named his next collection of parables, which hasn't been released yet, as Minotaur, to evoke the labyrinth and the way that Daedalus manufactured the labyrinth using his cleverness. And in the manufacture, he trapped himself, right? He didn't understand that Minos had in mind for him to be the first prisoner of the brilliant, amazing labyrinth that he created, because he didn't want anybody getting out and telling the secrets of how it worked. And so the very first person trapped by it was its architect. And this then becomes the metaphor for the way in which the ideologies that we consume, they don't just trap us, but they ride us where we can't see them. And they lead us to where our actions that we take that in the absence of an ideology might have liberated us, instead always turn us to the left, back in away from the exit and back into the infolding, so that rather than being stuck in one place and going, wow, I'm trapped, we instead can walk forever, seemingly free, while never actually leaving the walls of the labyrinth, because we've been trained to always make the same turnings that always keep us from getting out.
Well, that's learning from Las Vegas.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
easy to come in the casino, but it's hard to leave it.
Exactly. You know, that's how our minds get structured for us. Donald and then Dave. Go ahead, Donald.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you. All this talk about building. I bought one of those books by Alexander. Is that
Which one?
the Eternal Way of Building or something
Timeless
like
Way
that.
of Building.
Timeless Way of Building. And I was reading it, and it explained something to me that I really seldom have anybody ever come to my house because, but in reading the opening chapters of that book, I realized it's because if you come to my house, you see the inside of my mind.
Yes.
I mean, you may not have the skill to read it, but when I look around, I see me.
You're kind of naked there, right?
Yeah. It's very, and I never quite understood that until I realized that by the time I finish with an area, organizing it, making whatever changes and whatnot, it is an externalization of my own mind. And someone astute enough would walk in and look and say, oh, yeah, I know all about you now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Kenneth likes to say that when he's teaching philosophy classes, part of the reason why he doesn't really mind letting the students dictate the curriculum is that it almost doesn't matter where you start talking. The moment someone starts talking, they're giving themselves to him. They're saying how they reason, what makes sense to them, what's logical. And in so doing, without understanding it, they're unconsciously diagnosing themselves and anatomizing the traps that their mind is caught in, all the time, thinking that they're just saying in, innocent position or something. Well, piles and piles of books. I'm sort of naked in my house too, I think.
Well, maybe I should have built shopping malls.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to check out that Mad TV alternate ending for Wizard of Oz that Stephen put in the chat. The idea that after getting home from Oz, Dorothy covers Kansas in shopping malls that's something I need to see. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple points about the shopping malls and what's needed and what's not and what's useless. It sounded like it got a good job opportunity to be a Soviet planner. Dang cell phones. That AT&T phone works just fine, thank you. And along those, my parents were in a retirement home. They didn't want any dang video recorder. They didn't want any dang microwave oven. We're doing just fine the way things are, thank you.
Yep.
And the other thing about moving away from God, we're just going to hell on a handbasket. 1900, I think the life expectancy was 47, and now it's around 84, although unfortunately because of drugs and the virus, we've gone down the last 3 years. But I think that's a pretty good measure of our lives. And the other thing about religion, I'm a member of Veterans for Peace, and I think all religion does is start some good wars. Look over in the Middle East, the Sunni versus Shia. Well, hell, they're all Muslims. What the hell's going on? They think, oh, that's right. Northern Ireland, we got good Christians killing good Christians because of God. So I think we really will do better if we can get away from God one of these days. But anyway, that's my 2 bits for now. Thank you.
So let's talk about those. Because
Here first.
they're both worthy of exploration. So one thing is that our conception of religion was heavily formed by the medieval epoch. Right, as because the modern epoch is a rebellion against the medieval epoch, the modern epoch understands the world partly in terms of the medieval epoch. And that goes for religion. So we assume that the way religion was done in the medieval epoch is the definition of religion. But what's fascinating about studying the ancient epoch is that, contrary to a lot of propaganda that you'll hear from some in the Christian community, there was not a lot of persecution of Christians by Romans. It happened from time to time here and there, but over the swath of the period from the founding of Christianity to the point when Constantine made Christianity the official religion of Rome, most of the time, Christians were not oppressed for being Christians. In fact, it wasn't the done thing to go seek out people with other religions and try to exterminate them. That wasn't normal. It wasn't done in Greece. It wasn't done in Persia. It wasn't the way that people organized their societies. Under a polytheistic system of religion, the belief is that you're in a complicated world and it's full of things that have authority over you and you don't know what they all are. So if somebody else has discovered other gods, that's not a threat, that's an opportunity. You should add them to your pantheon. What is it that they know about the way the world works that you don't know, right? So you see this stuff with the Greeks in the Hellenistic period, you know, when they encounter Egyptian religion or Middle Eastern religion or India, they're constantly trying to match up their gods with those gods to see which ones are the same. And if they find some that don't match to any of their gods, they just add them to their religion. They're like, cool, you found one. Thank God. now that's one whole area of blunders that we can stop making now that we understand that there's this authority over us. The idea that only one religion is the right religion and that it has not just the right, but the duty to exterminate all other religions is part of the medieval proposition. It arose, for example, during the rise in the second and third centuries of Christianity. They had a major problem with heresies. They had too many gospels, too many epistles. They had people writing books left and right out of their ears, claiming to be from this person or that person, and they wanted to be taken seriously as a religion. So they started this process of clamping down on the creative ferment that had characterized early Christianity. They started chasing down different groups and saying, well, you're not allowed to say that, and these books are not part of the canon, you people need to shut up. And when it didn't work, they got violent. This is why you see Augustine advocating for torture and killing if necessary in order to convert people or at least stomp them out. You see the same thing in most of the early church fathers. You see Aquinas. Both of them are talking about, you know, the right and the duty to go stop the heretics.
Yeah, Augustine was so Monty Python at a certain moment when you think of it.
Yes.
I know you're the Messiah because I say you are, and I should know I've followed a few.
Yes, that line is brilliant, right?
I mean, Augustine had been a Manichaean, and then he found Christianity and suddenly said, that's the bee's knees, Christianity.
That's
I
right.
should know. I followed a
know.
few religions.
Exactly. So there is this way in which the concept of religious genocide is a medieval invention. It's not that nobody ever did it before, right? And, you know, given enough time, somebody will do anything. But rather the idea that an entire civilization should be governed by purification and the extermination of alternatives was a new idea. That wasn't how the Romans ruled. That wasn't how the Greeks ruled. That wasn't how the Persians ruled. That wasn't in anybody's game plan. It wasn't part of the ancient world order. And what that teaches us is that it's possible to have religions that don't commit genocide against each other. It's just not possible to have medieval religions that don't commit genocide against each other, because it's core to the medieval ideology that there is one right way and all the other ways are wrong. And so as we go into the modern epoch, well, we find ourselves, as Kenneth Smith, you know, says in this book, we find ourselves with enormous amounts of what we think of as our modern perspectives actually are leftover shards, unexamined, unquestioned shards that we've inherited from the medieval world or the ancient world. So that even when we try to oppose something, we oppose it in terms of the definitions that we just take for granted from the medieval era or the ancient era. And we don't know that we're doing it because we don't have the framework to understand where those ideas came from. When were they new and revolutionary? and when were they distinctive of an era, and when were they, a deviation from it, and so forth. It's a really interesting problem. In fact, the more we understand how deeply committed the medieval epoch was to genocide, the weirder it is to read Thucydides and Herodotus and other ancient writers describing the behavior of the ancient Romans and ancient Greeks, because they have opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to try to exterminate some other group on the basis of religion, and they don't do it. And when we're first reading them and we're not thinking about that in mind, we just take it for granted. It's like, okay, here's some things that happened. But after a while, we come to understand that is a very weird omission. And it tells us things about what we've been taking for granted about what's possible. Phil, and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, this thought came to mind. I think it's probably because you think about ancient religions. But it occurred to me just now that, first of all, I want to say that I like the Romantics, and they sort of made a big deal of pantheism. And but it seems to be within the context of modernity itself.
Yeah.
It was, in a way, an attempt to have an ecumenial, unify paganism,
right,
without excesses. So, in some sense, and a purified nature. I mean, it really is not the raw nature. They like the power of it, but it was sort of somewhat idealized. And that's the Romantic part of it, and that's the modern part of it, it seems to me.
Right.
But nonetheless, I did like it because it was a way to connect to nature in a way that was saw as a goodness of some sort, so idealized. But I think it was flawed in the sense that it's sort of like the purification had that sort of Christian notion, and
yes,
and the unification had the systematic notion,
yes,
rather than a diverse notion. And so, but I wonder what would have happened if it sort of was allowed to sort of evolve without the interference of the industrialization. It might have become different, it might have become more attached to the way nature is,
right,
and be a little bit more passive about relationship rather than projecting a kind of idealism into it.
right.
So while I like it, and I think it did bring a lot to, in a sense, being reconnected to nature, I think we have to keep that in mind, that it was an idea, a projection of sorts.
That's right.
And I think so. I think it was kind of the other side of modernity, what I would say the more benevolent side of modernity, rather than in a sense excess in the material consumerism. It was a kind of spiritualism of sorts, and so it put you in a kind of funny position because like people like Beethoven, a lot of the 19th century Romantic poets, they fit into that system,
Yes.
I don't know if they knew that they were not so much a counterpoint, but they were actually within the structure itself.
Yes.
So you might say something about that at some point, because I'm just on the edge of thinking about that, because I do like what they do, and in many ways they're a little bit like the Chinese painters and poets. It was connected to nature, but it was still sort of like an idealized form of it, rather than the fact that let
right.
nature be free. There's still sort of like Oh no, it's just their fault. So we could contemplate the goodness of what it is.
Yes, yes. Yeah, it's, in many ways, it's easiest to understand the human condition in tragic terms. I don't mean that it's sad, but in terms of Aristotle's formal theory of tragedy, that the story begins in the middle, and we don't know how we got here. Like the story of Oedipus is all about the fact that he doesn't know how he got there. He assumes that the horizon for the meaningful parts of his life in the first play, he assumes that that horizon is much smaller than it really is. And the parts that aren't in the play are more important than the parts that are in the play, but he doesn't know that. He assumes that what's close to him is the important stuff and what's further away is the unimportant, when the truth is the inversion of that. And so for moderns, we find ourselves in the middle. And most of what's determining our choices has already happened. And we don't know what already happened because we're a very ahistorical era. We use the history mostly as a way to sort of stamp out stories that please us, that make us feel good about who we are now, rather than trying to really deeply understand how on earth did we get here. And so the result is we find ourselves using all these terms and attaching ourselves to ideologies and preferences without knowing what they are or what they really signify. So an example of that is the notion of purity. We think purity is a good thing. It's good to be pure, good to be clean, right? And you see this with people who are all buying antibacterial soaps and scrubbing their hands religiously to kill off all the bacteria, under the mistaken belief that if they could take hospital conditions and spread them over the entire planet and sterilize everything, then it would lead to a pure world and we'd all be healthier than ever before. And not understanding that if we successfully sterilized all of the flora in our gut, we would die. And if we successfully sterilized all of the bacteria and archaea that are in the soil, it would stop growing crops. We literally don't know where our ideas lead or where they come from. We find ourselves having inherited them and having these emotional associations and intellectual associations with them that don't even begin to do justice to the full significance of them. So tuning up purity as an incredibly important good thing was part of what the medieval epoch did. That was part of its program of genocide. The idea that there's only one right way and every other way is a contaminant or it's filth, it's disgusting, and it's messing up our beautiful pure thing. This is the medieval civilizational mission in a nutshell. If we could just kill off every other religion, kill off every non-Indo-European language, just exterminate as widely as possible and convert everybody to our one set of beliefs, then the world will be good. We'll finally achieve that purity that makes us godly. And see, this isn't a knock on Christianity. This is a medieval conception of Christianity. But as moderns, in addition to rejecting a bunch of medievalism, we've taken in a bunch of medievalism that passed through that filter unexamined, and we don't really know what it means. And we forget that nature abhors a vacuum, and because it abhors a vacuum, nature also abhors a monoculture. And that evolution isn't driven by being the one single perfect profile that is the most fit. Evolution is driven by diversity, because when conditions change, whoever's the most fit now is going to be the least fit then. And the question is, do we have enough diversity lying around that somebody will be suitable for those new conditions, and then they can thrive while we die off and our species evolves? Like we on the one hand, we recognize that that's how evolution works, but on the other hand, we can't give up the notion of the one pure, true, most fit version of the species, and thus you get eugenics and all kinds of other crap. That's a huge distortion. We're like that monkey with the hand in the trap holding onto the banana, and we can't pull the hand out of the trap because we don't want to let go of the banana. We're attached to these things that hold us, that cause us to recreate holocausts and genocides and wars, and we can't see how it is.
You mean you don't believe in the master race? Shame
right?
on you.
It's a deeply counter-evolutionary idea, right? The idea that there's a single master race. Stephen, go ahead.
I believe in the master race. Whitey is on the moon.
Whitey's on the moon. Gil Scott Heron, he rocks, man. Love that song so much. Lately, you bring it up every week, and it brings a smile to my face every time.
Look, it was only 200 years. America went from Daniel Boone to being on the moon.
Yeah,
You can't beat that.
that's right. It's amazing.
I was going to say, I'll bring up an issue here. This is something I've been thinking about.
Yeah.
And we look at the era of monotheism. That was a medieval god, as you say. The god of Abraham was somehow codified in the Babylonian captivity. And the pagan gods in this whole much of this old world region were beginning to diminish. There was a whole new world. This was Jasper's axial age. This was a world that could see itself in terms of world-straddling empires, world-straddling trade routes.
Yes.
And those gods that Nietzsche loved, the gods of the fountain and the mystery and being out there and seeing a little detail and psychedelically flying off of the ancient Greek mysteries and all that, was being rubbed out by the encroaching God of the philosophers, the one all-powerful gods. And this was a process, and it's occurred to me that really, look what happened, that the Roman Empire went shopping for a more convenient God.
Yes.
And Muhammad did too. He found his more convenient God. I even there's a recent debate between Jordan Peterson and this Islamic fellow, and the Islamic saying, our God is beautiful, he's simple. You have the electric razor, we have the simple knife. Our God looks simple, but he can do so many things. I'm thinking, the monotheistic God became such a convenient God that he can dice, he can slice. And if you sign up, we'll give you a free set of steak knives to go with it.
Yes.
And yet, I'm starting to wonder if the monotheistic God is not the God of the merchant, that we're going to make God so convenient. Here's the one house. You don't have to go everywhere for your God now. Here's one God that will do it all.
Yes.
But Nietzsche laments the loss of the original piety. There's a slight impiety in this one God for all. To the point, the Roman Empire does it, the Frankish kings do it, and it reaches extreme nadir in that Viking fella that conquered Russia, who says, oh God, I'm having trouble with the pagan gods. I've tried. These monotheists, it's working so well. And of course, he's got Muslims on his border. He's got a Jewish Khanate on his border. He's got the Orthodox. He's got the Catholics. Hey, you guys, come along. Come to my throne room and show me your stuff. Okay, I decide in favour of the Orthodox, which is really brilliant because I can get all these trade agreements with the Byzantine Empire. He went shopping for gods. This Viking conquers Russia. I need a god for the whole nation. These pagan gods aren't working. I'm going to go shopping for gods.
Yes.
This is the downside of the medieval God, that he was a god that people found in the marketplace.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, Nietzsche has withering criticism for that notion of picking and choosing the divine based on what's convenient for you. And you're right. There's a direct relationship between doing that and getting rid of multiple coinages and just picking the dollar to be the international currency. That idea of it would all just be so much easier if there was only one thing, and that one thing could mean anything or be anything or do anything and interchange for anything. The protean nature of the dollar, the protean nature of the monotheist God, and the protean nature of the modernist conception of the will as the source of all meaning, they are all directly related to this medieval conception of monotheism. They all go together. We imagine that the modern epoch is totally different from the Dark Ages, and that they're dark and we're enlightened, and we've pushed ourselves so far away. But that's because we don't really scratch the surface of where our ideas have come from. When we scratch the surface, we discover eerily that what we have done is create feudal relationships at the economic level, right? Every corporation is ruled by a lord or a group of lords, and the peasants underneath have very little say in how the organization is structured. And that is feudalism just picked up directly and brought over, only without that inconvenient thing about not being able to dispossess the peasants from the land. Now we can dispossess the peasants anytime we want to, we just fire them. But other than that, it is a feudal hierarchy. And we imagine that it is an entirely different thing, consistent with our notions of freedom and objectivity and scientific progress. And because we do that imagining, we're able to look right at it and not see it for what it truly is. The same is true for our theology, the same is true for our economics, the same is true for the way we organize politically. There is a weird kind of sleepwalking that moderns do because of their anti-philosophical nature that prevents them from seeing the consequences of what they're doing, the context of what they're doing, the profundity of it. So we got to wrap up. So I'll go with Phil, and I saw Donald had his hand up for a moment too. So Phil first, and then we'll see if we can tease Donald.
You know, the moment Steve talked about, I was in another meetup group that talked about that.
Yeah.
Was about the transformation into the merchants. Was the invention of the printing press. We think of the printing press as very, very important, and it is very important in terms of creating the first information revolution, so to speak. But what it really did was transform the indulgences.
Yes.
It used to be that it was difficult to get an indulgence from the church, even though it was permitted, but it was issued by the church. But with the printing press, you could print out thousands of indulgences and stand outside of the church and sell it.
Yes.
It just made it so efficient and cheap that now it became literally clear that if you got the money, you're going to go to heaven.
Right.
Show me the money.
Yes. It exposed the corruption, right?
So if it wasn't for the invention of the printing press,
right, it could have kept going.
Slowly emerged, but it would not have been this rapid pace of transformation that allowed it to take place. So that was interesting, that while it produced the information revolution, even more fundamental, it created the indulgence revolution.
That's right. That's right. Which in turn directly drove the Protestant Reformation.
That's right.
Yeah, this is an example of Heraclitus says it would not be better for men if they got exactly what they wanted, right? The printing press gave them what they wanted. They had the ability now to keep up with the demand, but because they kept up with the demand, it just became too obvious what they were doing, right? Donald, go ahead.
I was going to say, you've talked several times now about the peasants and the land. And that's made me think a lot about what was the importance of the frontier in the United States, or other things where people's labor was not so easily alienated because there was free land. And that could be, the steppes of Russia, or, parts of Africa, or wherever there was, it was, I won't say unexploited because it was colonial. There were other people there, but they were unable to resist. So it was, the opportunity cost was very low.
Yes.
I've read I've read a lot about the building of the railroads across the United States, which took place after the Civil War.
Yes.
And they were saying in those things, so many of the crews had actually been infantry in the war, that all it took, if the Indians came sweeping across the plains, well, they formed their 3-deep or 7-deep battle line and just mowed them down. And they all knew how to do it because they'd had years of practice. But again, it was also this idea that what's so attractive, that people can turn their labor. Obviously also very wealthy people can turn their money into lots more money, but there was some opportunity there for the average guy to get that acreage,
Yeah.
you know, where they just had no chance, not on the East Coast of the United States or
Yes.
whatever.
Yes.
Oh, and the other thing for Phil, you know, life isn't fair, Phil, because if it was, only wealthy people would enjoy sex.
Or there's a modernist conception, isn't there? How can this be free to everybody?
Watch out, there is still one woman in this meeting right now, okay?
Hi, Jenny.
Yeah. No, I want to make a comment on what Donald said, that, but it wasn't really the frontier. Once again, it was the merchants that did it, right? Of course, there was buffalo hunters before then, but it was the government that realized the way to destroy the American Indians was to kill the buffaloes. And they actually contracted professional buffalo hunters.
Yeah.
And within less, I probably, you know, I don't know the date, but within
Decade.
10 years,
Yeah.
they completely decimated the food source.
Yeah.
And that's how you kill them, not by lining up soldiers in the front line. And so they finally had to say, we give up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Except for a very few who died with their boots on, but nonetheless, we give up because the food source was decimated by the
Phil.
contract.
Thank you.
So we're at the end of our time for today, and we'll pick this up again next week. We've made some progress into the modern section, and we're going to dive a lot more deeply into it next time. But I had a good time. I hope you guys did too.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you. Bye, Joseph.
Thank you, Rick. Bye, Jenny.
Bye. Good
Bye.
talking to you, Dave.
Hell, even thanks to God. What the heck?
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye, Jenny.
Bye.